Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Miller. Every week, I chat with fascinating people from all walks of life in order to bring you knowledge, inspiration, and insight. If you enjoy the show, you can support it by subscribing, leaving a review, and sharing it with a friend. This is the Jeremy Miller Podcast. Zach Bitter, welcome to the podcast, man. I'm really excited to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeremy.
Man, so I feel like before we dive into anything, there's a lot of stuff I want to ask you about. But before we do that, do you kind of want to just tell people like some of your big accomplishments? I know you've got a lot of world records you've done. Just kind of give people a 10,000 foot view of some of the things you've done.
Yeah. I would consider myself an endurance athlete, podcast host, and coach. And I think endurance athlete, for the most part, is probably fed into that stuff. So, or the most, I should say. Although I started out as a teacher, so you could argue that the coaching, teaching aspect was maybe the big driver at one point. But yeah, I got into ultramarathons after running track and cross country in high school and college. Sort of learned slow what endurance was all about in terms of just like the actual pieces to a puzzle that you put together to run a race, whether it was like a 5K, a 10K, marathon, or anything like that. And through that slow learning process, I started identifying like which workouts were more like motivators for me versus ones where I felt like, okay, I'm going to do this because I know it's going to make me better, but I'm not going to like it. And to be fair, I like the whole process, but there are definitely ones I lean towards. And the way I leaned was like the long run was kind of my favorite one. So that sort of led me to ultramarathon. And yeah, that led me to just kind of really diving into that world. And this would have been back in like 2010, 2011. So the sport was definitely growing a lot back then, but compared to where it is today, it was still kind of sloping upward. And yeah, through that time, I think timing is everything with a lot of this stuff. And for me, getting into it when I did put me in a position to chase some world records and things like that. So in 2013, I first kind of got really familiar with like flat, runnable, controllable environments and broke a world record for distance run in 12 hours and an American record for time in 100 miles. And that sort of got me interested in that side of the sport, which had very little attention. It still does relative to the trails, I would say.
What was your time for that?
That was 11 hours, 47 minutes for 100 miles. And then I did 101.7 miles for the 12-hour time frame.
What are the average minute per mile paces on those?
That's 7:04 for that one.
That's damn near sub 3 marathon pace.
Yeah, it's basically 4 sub 3 hour marathon. That's actually the best way to explain it, I find, is because people just don't really typically, unless they're in the world of ultramarathon, have a perspective of what these like double digit hour time frames. And then you get into the trails, it's even more like skewed because now it's like you don't really know, did they do that up a 1,000-foot climb or was that on a flat runnable trail? And yeah, so looking at it through the lens of like marathon times, people usually have some perspective with like Boston qualifiers and stuff like that, so they can sort of wrap their head around it then.
Geez, so you did the 12-hour, that was on the track, and you did both those at the same time, right? Like you set the 100-mile record and then just kept going to set the 12-hour record? Yeah,
that was actually a funny experience because I went into that event targeting a 100-mile American record. I had actually done a 50-miler on the most runnable course I'd ever been on, from ultra running standpoint anyway. And it was sort of like an impromptu race, actually. Like I was training for the 50-mile road championships, felt like I was really fit for it. One of my buddies from college at the time was training for the Chicago Marathon. He was in good shape and we were doing some workouts, and I felt like I was matching him on like the hillier workouts, which was kind of good for the road course they're doing for the 50-mile championships. It's like rolling kind of gravel hills for the most part. So I was pretty excited about that. And I ended up running a good time, but getting second place. So I was like kind of conflicted as to how to like really internalize that result. And the way I did it at the time was I jumped in another race like 2 weeks later and ended up running 5 hours and 12 minutes for 50 miles on this real flat out and back. Yeah. Like 50-mile course in Chicago.
That's quick.
Yeah. So that sort of highlighted to me anyway, this idea of course specificity and how like if you're training on a lot of roads, and where I was living in the Midwest at the time, like racing on those type of trains are going to work in your favor to some degree. So I got invited to the Desert Salsas Track Invitational. That was the race where I did the 100 miles in 12 hours at. And I knew very little about that side of the sport, or even the sport in general to some degree at that time. So I didn't even know there was a 12-hour world record until like 90 miles into the race.
Oh my gosh. Somebody said like, hey, you just keep running.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what happened. Actually, one of the race directors, one of my good friends, Nick Curry, he came up to me at the perfect time. Actually, I think I was like just about to hit 90 miles. I was starting to feel the fatigue of the day where I was like, okay, in my mind, I was like, I can go this pace, but not a second faster. And he came over to me and he's like, all right, you're on pace for the American record. If you maintain pace, you'll probably break it by like 6-7 minutes. But if you stay out here after you hit 100 miles and get to 12 hours, you'll probably break the world record for 12 hours. And I was like, oh, shit, there's a 12-hour world record. So it was kind of, I had this like new motivator that I wasn't even aware was there. And he gave it to me at the right time where I didn't have enough time to do a bunch of damage by like taking off too fast too soon. But I was clipping laps. It's on a 400-meter track, so I was clipping laps like 4 seconds quicker than I was before. So I went from like literally 1 minute earlier thinking I can't go a second faster per lap, but I can maintain, to going 3-4 seconds per lap faster. And that just kind of highlighted in my mind also, just along with the core specificity side of things, like how powerful the mindset is with these things. And then just like getting the right information and compartmentalizing things at the right time in the right place throughout it is powerful. And yeah, I ended up actually breaking the American record by over 12 minutes then because I sped up. So I closed in on some of that time. And then, yeah, I got the 12-hour world record as well. And that kind of got me excited of like track races, runnable 100-milers, and just really going after time versus just place and course and things like that.
Wow, that's amazing, dude. I think ultra running, it's just such a mental thing. Like running in general is so mental. And I actually heard you, or maybe I read it like an article or something. You said ultra running is a logic sport. Do you remember that? Do you remember saying that?
No, but I probably said something like that anyway. I think like with the way I think about it is like it's slow. Like no matter how fast you're running, like I whittled my 100-mile pace down to 6:47.5 per mile over those years after that first race. And it's like 6:47.5 is fast, but it's like relative to what I could do for like a 5K or even a marathon, it's a lower intensity. It's under my aerobic threshold. So you get to a certain point where like it is more about like staying mentally focused. And if you can kind of stay mentally focused better, you're more likely going to hit these achievable paces. When you let your mental focus lapse or you take a mental break, you have negative stuff creep into your head. That is where you start to lose that focus and then make that easy pace, relatively speaking, very difficult. And then you build monsters in your head and it can spiral out of control. So yeah, in the track kind of, I would say there's positives and minuses to running 100 miles on a track. And one of the positives is you have everything you need whenever you want it. You see the whole course right away, so there's no surprises. If you slow down, you know you slow down. The problem with that is it's very apparent to you. So you can let that be negative too, where if I run a lap slower than I should have, I'm very much aware of it. I can't cope at all. I have to either decide really quick to get back on track or make a rash decision as I don't have it today. So one of the bigger things I've learned by doing multiples of these type of races is you look back at ones that you've done in the past where you were convinced like, yeah, I just didn't have it that day. I dropped out, or I didn't have it that day, so I slowed down the last 20 miles. You make all these excuses to rationalize it. And in reality, then you finally push through some of those spots where you hadn't in the past. And you're like, makes you wonder, like, was it really just not my day back then? Or did I just not have the mental focus ready for that versus the physical side of things? My guess is, physically speaking, I was probably capable of running my fastest 100-miler much earlier in my career had I had the mental side of the sport fine-tuned the way maybe I do now.
So do you think it's just like limitations that you put on yourself, or it's just like when you get to those moments where all that negativity can creep in? Do you think it's those moments where over time you just kind of develop that like callous to it, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of limitations. I think if you don't put limitations on yourself, you will likely get through those maybe a little bit easier because you just have a little more self-belief. So you hit that roadblock, you're just maybe a little more stubborn. But you have to manage that because it's still 100 miles. So if you start thinking too aggressively too early, you make the mistake I think most ultra runners make, myself included, the top people in the sport included, is getting out too fast. And getting out too fast is going to, create an environment just like I think with any endurance event. I don't think there's anything too drastically different between 100 miles and like the marathon and the 10K when it comes to pacing, where you want to like bank time. Like, people don't talk about banking time in the marathon or the 10K. They talk about this precise range of maybe like a fraction of a percentage to either side of even. And that's probably where the world records are going to lie.
Right.
I don't think the 100-mile is all that much different. I think there's maybe some course variance where like you have these courses where like the first half is really runnable, the second half isn't, or vice versa, where you're going to have like from a time standpoint, bigger shifts. But I think from an energy output standpoint, it should be pretty even across the board. So you both have to be controlled in the sense that you can't get so like confident in yourself that you get way ahead of yourself, but you also have to have that confidence to almost step back and allow it to be easy in the beginning so that at the end you can stay focused and then believe that you can kind of keep hitting that pace even though you've been doing it all day long. And there's almost like a certain amount of confidence in being able to do that because you're not doubting that you can keep doing it. The banking time group is like, they're almost doubting themselves because they're like, I can't replicate that first 50 miles in the second 50 miles. So I need to bank time. And in reality, they're probably adding time, like every minute they gain, they're probably adding 2 or 3.
That's a good way of looking at it. I always think of it as like banking energy versus banking time. You described it perfectly there. Yeah.
And I think there's a mental fatigue to that too. I think when you get out too fast, you burn mental energy as well as physical energy. So when you get to that hard part at like 70, 80 miles and you need to be really focused because any negative thing that is going to try to creep in at that point. So you got to be ready to kind of push past that. And if you've kind of drained your mental capacity a little too much as well as your physical capacity, you're just not going to have the will to do it. And I think that's probably where like when I look at it in hindsight, if I want to be a little more generous to my previous self, I would say, look, you probably just got out a little too fast. Therefore, it maybe you weren't maybe mentally weak. You just didn't distribute your mental energies as appropriately as you should have.
Did you enjoy the monotony of running on a track? Because like you said, it's predictable. It's very reliable. Every lap's exactly the same. Did you enjoy that?
It's definitely a love-hate relationship. So like you get into these, when it's good, it's really good because you don't have to think about anything. You can just zone out. You can just cruise. You can be super in tune with like every step. And it's almost therapeutic. It's like meditating. But then like if you hit a rough patch for whatever reason, you just hate being out there and you have to try to like tell yourself that that's going to pass. And the thing I find works the best for that is practicing that in training. So like if I'm doing a long run, like down at Austin High, I sort of do mini versions of it where it's like you start a 3-hour long run on the track.
I can't imagine that.
Yeah, 30 minutes in, like if you're thinking about, I got to get to 3 hours, that's going to be super self-defeating.
Yeah.
And you got to just kind of say, okay, well, I'm not going to worry about 3 hours. I'm going to do like this, get into the moment. You got to like, I like to look at this as there's like times to zoom in and there's times to zoom out. So time to zoom in is when you have 3 hours on the track and you're early on. Zoom in because you don't want to be thinking about how you're doing 3 hours. You want to be in the moment as long as you're running at a proper pace and intensity, hydrating, fueling, and all that stuff, which should be like pretty routine once you get that dialed in. Then you're in a good spot. You want to zoom out at times when you're like standing on the starting line or your days before the race itself, and you're thinking like, you're hyper focusing in on this 100 mile, you're turning it into this monster in your head. You're thinking, how am I going to do 100 miles? How am I going to maintain pace? You want to zoom out and think like, wait a second, I've been preparing for this for 4 to 6 months. Every hour, every mile, all that time for that 4 to 6 months leading into the race is so much bigger than the race itself that by zooming out, you minimize that monster that is the race and you can kind of like relieve some of that anxiety and stress. So it's all about kind of, and I guess maybe go full circle on sort of the question at hand is just like, I think running a good 100 miler or your best 100 miler is really learning like those different experiences, which you can't necessarily get without doing. Like I can sit here and try to tell you, or we could bring someone twice as smart as me who's done 5 times as many of these as I have, come in and share their wisdom and stuff. And I think like that's useful to kind of get you into the right framework. But then from there's going to be a handful of things that you should probably just have to experience and then do it again and fine tune. I don't think anyone is going to run their best 100 mile or their first one.
Yeah, it seems like, everybody's so unique and so different. And like the points in which that negativity or that mental toughness starts to lapse or something, it's probably kind of the same for, it's different for everybody, but the same for individuals, if that makes sense. So like, do you notice there's certain points now that you've done a number of these, that there's a point consistently where that comes up and then you kind of expect it or you're prepared for it, or is it totally random?
Yeah, there's some sticking points. I think some of them are probably from prior experiences and some of them make a little more sense just by like the nature of the sport. One is like typically like if I'm training for like a track race, my long run is going to probably end somewhere between 3-4 hours. I'm not going to probably do a single run much further than that. So you hit that point on race day or get a little bit past that where you're like, all right, now I'm further than I went in training. It's kind of a weird spot because it presents this weird mindset of, okay, I'm further than I've gone in training, but then it also presents this opportunity to think about how much is left. And you never want to think about how much is left, especially when how much is left is 65 miles. Yeah. Like, so I think like that's always a sticking point there, that you have to kind of like say, all right, time to zoom back in again and focus on the next step of the process versus thinking of 100 miles. 100 miles will come sooner than you think if you let it. So then it's like trying to get to like another benchmark, which oftentimes can just be like, all right, let's get to 40 miles. If I can get to 40 miles, I can get to 50 miles. That's halfway. I can start thinking about how I'm going to attack the second half of the course. Then I'll get to 100K and you start to, work your way through. Another sticking spot is sometimes can be the midway mark. It can be positive or negative because I think 50 miles gives me a really good perspective of whether I approach the race properly or not. And that can be good or bad because if I didn't, then I'm staring down the barrel of like, all right, this is going to be a tough day. But if I did it right, it's exciting because it's like now I get to kind of like turn this 100-miler into a 50-miler and really try to like fine tune this next phase of it. Because I've gotten to a point now, especially on courses I've done before or controlled areas where when I cross the 50-mile mark, I can kind of tell like, okay, this was sustainable. This is something I can do versus I overreached a little bit. It's a little more damage control and I'm going to run a positive split today. It's about how much of a, how can I manage it best, I guess is the way to maybe look at it. So that's kind of like a little bit of a conflicting spot, I would say. 100K is just kind of a unique spot because I've done a few of those races. So I kind of know what it feels like to do an all out 100K. It's unique in the sense that it's 100 kilometers, but then you're also still a little further than what my typical longest long run is going to be from the finish line. So if I'm feeling a little like worn at that point, you can get negative and be like, how am I going to do a whole nother long run? 70 is another spot where if you're having a really good day, you can frame it as like one more long run. It's no longer 100 miles. It's one more long run. I can do this. I've done 6, 7, 8 of these in the lead up. Or it can be like I'm almost maxed out already and I got to do a whole nother long run. And you have all these, you have these perspectives from training where you went into a long run, it was just miserable. And it was like, I didn't properly prepare for this. I overreached. This needed to be a deload weekend. Instead, I tried to stress it. And then you just have a bad experience and you're like, you can kind of think, okay, that's what this last 30 miles is going to be like versus that time where like you timed everything perfectly and just nailed that 30-mile long run or 3-4 hour long run, whatever it happens to be. And then you think, okay, I can do that again. So it is all these points I think have potential to be very positive if you're able to frame them right, which has a component of pacing properly, taking care of yourself, and then also getting in the right headspace. Or you can kind of frame them wrong, I guess, which again has a component of going too fast, not managing nutrition, hydration, and then burning mental energy and things like that.
I like that idea of thinking of it, chunking it up into like long runs. Because I mean, we do those every week. Yeah. 2 a week sometimes.
Yep.
It's like a very understandable, comprehensible way to like break up. And a lot of these questions are coming from like a selfish perspective too, because I have some ultras coming up. And
do you? Which ones are you doing?
I'm doing the Bighorn 50 miler.
Sweet.
That's in 2 weeks. Next year, I'm going to sign up for the 100. That'll be my first 100. And so I'm like trying to figure out the strategy. And I'm always just curious to see how people like yourself that have done several of these, like what their approach is and their mindset and their tactics. So I like that long run idea though.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think with 100 miles, the difference between 100 miles and 50 miles is you have enough opportunity to go through more series of kind of like the ebbs and flows of the day. So you're just more likely to get to a point where you're like, this is rock bottom, and you don't necessarily have an experience that would suggest it could get better. But it can. So if I can tell someone who's never done 100 mile or anything, it usually is like when you get to a spot, say 70 miles, it seems to be around that time frame a lot of times, because usually people have done like a 50 miler or 100K before. So it's not unfamiliar territory, but they're heading into unfamiliar territory. And if they feel really bad during that, if they hit a rough patch during that, it can be very easy to think, it's going to get progressively worse than this. And I can't imagine 30 more miles of progressively worse versus this is going to actually get better. And I might in 5 miles feel better than I did all day for some reason.
Yeah, I always hear everybody say that 100 miles is life in a day.
Yeah.
Just meaning, the ebbs and flows and the ups and downs. Do you, it sounds like you experience every bit of that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I think there's so much more too. I always like to look at the sport from the perspective of how broad it actually is. So like, you have like kind of the entry distance of 50K, which in and of itself can be broad. You can have flat runnable 50Ks where, world-class times are well under 3 hours. And then you can have like these mountain courses where world-class performances are like 5 hours. So like even that has some range to it. But then, 100 miles seems far, 12 hours seems long. This type of stuff is long and far, but the sport just has such a long nature to it where you can do 24 hours, 48 hours, 6 days. You can do transcontinental runs. There's a race in New York every summer where they go just over half a mile around this loop and they get 16 hours a day to make progress and they have to take an 8-hour break and they just try to get to 3,100 miles and they're out there all summer.
Around basically. A half mile loop?
Yeah.
Have you done that before?
No,
Do you have any intentions of doing something like that?
I've got intentions to do some long haul stuff like 1,000-mile type stuff,
like Appalachian Trail or something.
Yeah, like transcontinental stuff. I was actually going to do the transcontinental run, which is just San Francisco to New York in 2021, and I got an injury right kind of during the peak phase of that, so I had to cancel that one. And I think what I learned from that, which is a very new experience, training for it was much different because it's just a different undertaking. It's a logistical monster, as I'm sure you can imagine, but it's also a physical monster. So
were you going to do like 50 miles a day roughly for if you were going to do it?
You want to know the record for that is 72.5 miles a day. So I was going to try to
30
target
30 days or something.
It's exactly 6 weeks, so 42.
Holy shit. I saw Will Googe just did it. Did you follow him at all when he was doing that? I think it was like 50 some days or something. I don't remember what it
that's pretty fast. Yeah. Pete Kostelnick has the record at, it's just, the crazy thing about Pete's record is he's done something crazier than this, but he averaged 72.5. He had a day off in there because early on, I think it was like day 7 or 8, really early, he did a lot of his training in the flat. I think he was in Nebraska at the time, somewhere in the Midwest. And he went over the Sierras and just pushed a little too hard on some of the inclines and like just aggravated some of the tendons in his ankle from just the flexion that he got on that pitch from, essentially hammering it all day long. So he had to take a day to let that settle down. And he still averaged 72.5 over the course.
That's insane. Yeah. What's the longest? Have you done anything over 100?
The furthest I've run is 125.
125. What was that? Was it a race or?
Yeah, so that was an event I actually did. I was doing a 24-hour and just seeing how far you can get in 24 hours. And I actually broke the 200-kilometer track American record and stopped there because I had an issue with my right Achilles tendon that was bothering me a little bit in those last couple hours of that race. And my main goal race, I don't know why I was trying to do, well, I know why I was, but this was in 2014. So I was still pretty dumb. And it was, I had this idea where I wanted to get a world 24-hour qualifier, but I really wanted to get a world 100-kilometer team qualifier. So I sort of had a priority of,
what are you qualifying for if you, how does that work?
There's world championships. So just like they have for like all the track stuff, they don't have the Olympics for any of the ultra marathons unless you want to call like 50K race walking, which would technically be an ultra marathon, but they don't have like Olympic stuff. So they do the world championships for the 100-kilometer and the 24-hour. Okay. And just the way like the year kind of played out, there's the national championships, the US national championships for the 100K, is the easiest. I shouldn't say the easiest way to get it. It's the most direct way to get on the team because if you win it, it's an auto qualifier versus like running a time standard and hoping you have one of the top 6 times essentially, which is then you're waiting to see if anyone else tries to snipe that spot from you. So my goal was to get on the team by winning the national 100-kilometer championships, which was 4 weeks after this 24-hour I was doing. So I thought in my mind, okay, I can do the 24-hour, get a qualifier there, and then do the 100K. So when I had that discomfort in my right Achilles tendon, I was like really like nervous that I was going to do something that would be a little more long-term and I wouldn't be able to do the 100K. So once I hit 200 kilometers on that race, which, roughly 125 miles was, I stopped there just to be kind of preserve guess.
Yeah.
I went on to win that 100K, so it was a good
Oh my
move in
gosh.
hindsight.
That's cool. Man, how many hundreds have you done altogether?
That's a good question. Not as many as I should know this number, because it's not as many as you would think, given that I can't come up with the exact number right now. I mean,
one is a lot to me.
Yeah, I guess you could look at it that way. I think it's like 12 or something like that. I did my first one in 2012, and I think I've probably averaged at least one a year since then. I could run through. I've done, if you look at just the distance, I've done well over 100 ultramarathons.
Okay.
And then like in terms of like structured actual events, I'm probably just under 100 of those. And
what got you into all this to begin with? Like, I know you said you did cross country, track, high school, college. But what got you into running initially, like all the way back to like junior high, or where'd you get into running initially?
Yeah, pretty early. Presidential Physical Fitness Challenge is what even introduced me to endurance running.
I have no idea what that is.
Yeah, you're too young. How old are you?
25.
Okay, yeah. I don't know when they stopped doing presidential physical fitness stuff. Probably shortly after I was out of high school would be my guess, because I was a teacher. I don't ever remember them doing it when I was teaching. And it's basically this battery of fitness tests where you just do it's actually cool. I wish they'd bring it back, because it highlights where your strengths and weaknesses are at. And it's pretty well balanced in the sense that it's not just strength, it's not just endurance, it's not just mobility and stretching, it's all of that. So I got my first perspective amongst my peers as to you're not just fast or slow, you're not just strong or weak, you're not my mind at that time was there's athletes and there's non-athletes, and you want to try to be an athlete if you can. and I realized it's if we're going to have a pull-up competition or the 100-meter dash, there's going to be peers that are going to just smoke me in that. And then when we got to the mile run with my very small class, I realized, I can beat all my peers at this. So that was kind of my first perspective of just discipline advantages from one sport to the next.
How old were you when you did that?
I think 11 or 12.
Okay, so it was probably
sixth grade, I think. Yeah, sixth grade. So then it was just kind of that sort of fed into everything from there, where my dad was intuitive enough to recognize that he should do as many sports as possible in order to really figure out what I like and stuff. And that was I wouldn't say it was even encouraged. It was expected, which I'm very grateful of. I remember I had a friend in middle school. His parents said you can do 2 sports per year. I was like, man, that sucks. I can do as many as I want.
That's cool. So you played everything growing up?
Yeah,
basically.
all of it: baseball, football, soccer. I even did some league softball in high school, track and field, cross country, most of it. Anything. I golfed for a little bit, very unstructured. I never did any competitive golf or anything like that. But yeah, it was. I had a lot of experience with a lot of different sports, so that was, I think, just a good way to kind of get introduced to fitness in general. And then, like I said before, really kind of get an idea of what am I more naturally good at? What am I going to have to really work hard at to get better at? Where are those strengths and weaknesses? And my dad was also kind of aware enough to recognize okay, well, if he's better at one thing than the next, encourage it, but don't force it. So the opportunities were always presented to do track and field day. We'd go on these summer vacations, and my dad would find this random cross country meet just outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And
is that where you grew up at?
I grew up in Wisconsin. Yeah, we were in at the time we were in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, which is kind of on Lake Michigan between Green Bay and Milwaukee. So we would do some big family vacations every other year, and then we'd also just do some smaller ones in the state too, on off years and things like that. And so just having opportunities presented to do the sport. And then in high school, I didn't even do cross country my freshman year. I actually played football. Reminded myself that wasn't the move, and then did cross country for the final 3 years. But I did track all 4 years in high school, and recognized my freshman year in track, you should probably do the mile or 1600, 3200. And that was kind of the catalyst of that becoming kind of the cornerstone of the sports I would target. Sophomore year was actually a pretty big one for me, because I went into that cross country season with very little expectations. I think high school was a little bit of an eye-opening experience to me, where it wasn't it was bigger in every sense, but one of it was I'll very much get cut from the basketball team. I'll ride the bench on the football team, and but I can make varsity in track. And then so going into cross country in my sophomore year, I don't know that I had the foresight of thinking you should target being like a contributing member of the varsity team. I was just like, maybe I'll get lucky and make varsity. And it ended up being that I made varsity pretty early in the season, and then ended up working my way up as far as the third person on the team as a sophomore.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that was exciting. And I mean, we had a junior senior heavy team that year, and we had a pretty good team. We had one guy who was pretty high caliber, but the rest of the team was kind of just more balanced, where we had a lot of back and forth and a lot of groups where you have these packs kind of coming through the finish line close together, which the way you score cross country meets is just aggregate position, and you want a low score. So if you get first place, it counts 1 point. Get 10th place, it's 10 points. So you get these like teams where they have like two really fast guys that finish like first and third, but then they're 3, 4, and 5 are way in the back. So they end up scoring a ton of points, even though they had those two real fast guys, versus a team that has no one in the top 10, but they're all like 12, 13, 14, 15, right. 16, and then you can score a few points. Yeah. So it's like, we had an interesting team, but it was kind of clear to me, like by the next year, my junior year, I was gonna be the fastest guy on the team if I did any sort of preparation in the summer. So I did very minimal, but some preparation in the summer.
Like outside of what your team was doing?
Yeah. My junior year, I definitely wasn't as focused as I could have been, which was probably good in hindsight, but also, I mean, you leave some stuff on the table, I think, early on by doing that, but then the fact that I'm still in the sport today may be because I didn't overrush things as well. It really wasn't until my senior year we had a coach who was the first kind of adult figure in my life who wasn't just there to coach because there was like they were asked to. It was like he wanted to be there. And
that makes a big difference.
Yeah. My other coaches, I shouldn't say they didn't want to be there. They just didn't have any real life experience with running.
Right.
So like this guy, he was a runner and he loved it. And you could tell he would talk about it all day, anytime. He would talk about all the aspects of it. He's the first person that I really knew that would actually feed me information that was very curiosity provoking. Mm. And I definitely didn't take as much advantage of that as I should have at the time, but he put me in a position where by the time I went to college and then had that next level of resources and opportunities to learn in front of me, I knew like, okay, this time I need to actually like really pry for that information and like think about it versus just kind of like doing what I'm told by the coach when he says this workout today, that workout tomorrow, kind of a mindset. And yeah, and that, I ran 2 years of track and 3 years of cross country in college before kind of getting into longer stuff.
Where'd you run in college?
University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point.
Okay.
They're a pretty high quality Division III school. So they would oftentimes be at nationals and things like that. But yeah, not a powerhouse in terms of like D1 or anything like that. But most my teammates were faster than me at the 5K to 10K. So
you had the endurance though.
Yeah. In hindsight, for sure. It's like I had a propensity to run for a very long period of time, but 5K and 10K short when you're an ultramarathon.
Right.
So.
Did you ever go through that stage? I feel like most people do, where they just despise running, they hate running. And for me, at least, it always came from other sports where the only time we ran was because it was punishment because we were in trouble. Did you ever go through that, or did you love running from the beginning?
I've always loved running from the beginning, but I've hated aspects of running. Mm-hmm. So like, I think we talked about this a little bit in the beginning where like short intervals for me, I didn't like those in high school. I have a hard time remembering if I liked them or not in high school. I'm guessing I didn't. I think I probably liked them less than the other stuff, but I just really wasn't paying close enough attention to recognize at a really detailed level, and I wasn't doing long enough long runs probably to know where the balance was there. Right. Everything was more or less the same still, because I was also doing a lot of like rec sports and things where like sprinting was kind of part of that. So I probably just lumped it all into the same category. But in college, I think I recognized that short intervals are something I have to really like get excited to do, and I have to be a little more mindful around them and do them properly versus the volume. I can tend to get away with a lot of stuff.
What about the intervals do you not like? Just because it's not long enough?
Yeah, I think there's maybe something about you get up to that gear where like you're kind of at that last point where like it becomes a little bit less of like I need to stay mentally focused to do this. There is that component, which I learned later. But in the interval itself, it's just so intense that like I feel like everything just kind of like closes in and it's more just like redlining or close to redlining. I sort of like the thought process or the decision making within running, and that gets a lot more involved when you're going slower. So I do like intervals. They just tend to be long intervals because you can do a little more of that in long intervals. And what I've learned to appreciate with short intervals now is you can get that same thing. You just need to do it over the course of the workout versus in any one interval. And it's exciting because it's sort of like the race where, like, let's say I'm doing 10 by 2 minutes or something like that. When I'm done with that third one, pretty much every time I'm going to start questioning whether I should do 10. I'm going to start thinking, well, maybe 8 would be better. 8 might actually be better for me because 10 is too much. 10 is actually going to make me slower. And, you start kind of talking yourself out of those last two. So you sort of have to back up and say, okay, well, why am I thinking about intervals 9 and 10 right now? I'm not even started 4 yet. So then you do the same thing you would in a race. You back up and then you go, okay, I'm going to do 4, see how I feel. Do 5, see how I feel. Eventually you get to 8, you do it, and you're like, yeah, I can do 2 more. I could probably do 4 more, and that's where I want to be. So I've learned to like that. It's just kind of a little more of a type 2 fun, I would say.
Right.
And some of it's just being present and reflecting better, because there's also the component of, like, you do a workout and there's the value of, like, okay, I did the workout. I'm getting that physiological adaptation if I do this often enough with the right recovery and the right process. But then there's also just paying attention to how it makes you feel the rest of the day. When I was younger, I think I just assumed those sensations were there independent of the running. Whereas now I very much recognize, like, if I don't do short intervals at all, if I just cut that out of my training program, there's like an aftermath of, like, just emotions and the way you feel that is unique to that particular workout. So now I look at, like, these different phases of training when I'm doing, like, short intervals, long run development and stuff, is like, there is, like, an experience here that's unique. So I'll do them long enough to get the adaptations and sort of maybe get a little bit sick of that particular process. Then I move on to the next part of the process and kind of get that next experience. And I think that's what actually makes it sustainable, is when you start thinking about the variety within it and how that kind of actually changes and how they actually impact other things other than the running, so that you're gaining value from it or recognizing value from it that you wouldn't otherwise. So yeah, there's a lot, when I think about, I'm sure everyone has this experience to some degree, but when you think about just, like, how much stuff you did and went through the motions with when you were younger versus, like, when you get older and you've done it enough and you start to really, like, have the opportunity, I think, because you've done it so much, to start thinking of it from other angles is kind of an exciting spot to be.
That's cool, man. How do you go about programming intervals now? Like, if you're training for a 100-mile race, how do you program intervals into a training schedule? Yeah. So if we zoom out, I'm going from a philosophy of, first of all, gather everything that's important to getting from the start to the finish as fast as I can. Then from there, you go from things that are least specific to the intensity you're going to do on race day to most specific kind of order of operations. And then weaknesses are generally better addressed early on. Strengths are better leaned into near the end, if you want to balance those into the equation too. So what that usually looks like with 100 miles, since it's so far to one end of the intensity spectrum, is have a good foundation. Just like building a house, you want a strong foundation. So whatever beautiful thing you build on top of it is nice and secure. So you still want that strong, low, like what people call, like, zone 2 or under your aerobic threshold, easy running foundation. But if you have that and then you start heading into the structured plan, start with short intervals is what I'll usually do. So I'll do usually short intervals between, like, 2 to 4 minutes. I'll go as short as 30 seconds. But usually not past 4 minutes for the most part. Do you do everything time-based like that? Okay.
Yeah. And when I was younger, I would train on distance because that's just what the protocols were like. So I have some perspective as, like, a 2-minute interval is going to be about roughly this distance. So then, or 3 minutes is the one where it's like, it's getting pretty close to a kilometer for me. So I can sort of look at it through that lens to some degree. Time's just better though, because it is, the way I look at it is, like, intensity is the constant. Whether I'm back in high school, in college, midway through my ultra running career today, the intensity of a VO2 max short interval workout is going to feel the same. What changes, hopefully, is the pace at which you're going to do it or the distance you are going to cover. So those are both moving targets. So when people program by distance, like kilometer repeats, they're sort of programming a moving target, unless it's something where they're looking at it through the lens of, like, okay, I'm racing a 5K and I'm going to do a broken 5K where you do, like, 5 by 1 kilometer at goal 5K pace with, like, 30-second recovery jog in between. That, I think, has some value to it. But if we want to kind of, like, that's creativity, that's, like, complicated, that's like in a more of an advanced, like, training protocol, where I think, like, most people want to back up, learn the intensities first, simplify it as much as possible so that you get really intimate with what it feels like to do a short interval, what it feels like to do a long interval, what it feels like to do like a base run is what I call something that's like in the easy category, but kind of the higher end up to your aerobic threshold. What it's like to run like just an easy recovery run, like how does that differ from the base run in terms of the way it feels, and really kind of dial that in. And then once you kind of have those tools available to you, you can get as creative as you want if you want to go outside of that, and that like motivates you to do the plan. There's another intensity too, which is just race day intensity, which is going to be important. So sometimes that happens to fall within one of those. Sometimes it doesn't. Like marathon is a really good example of this. If you take like someone who's roughly like a 3-hour marathoner, chances are they're going to be somewhere between their aerobic threshold and their lactate threshold. So that would be, for me, that'd be like they're between their base run and their long interval intensity. So even though it's not one of those intensities, they very much want to practice that at some point because it's the exact intensity they're going to be doing on race day. So it's just when I talk about the order of operations, that would be end of the plan because it's going to be the most specific to race day intensity.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So then for 100 miles, we're working at a much slower intensity than marathon. Mm-hmm. So it can be more skewed. There's less blending of intensities within the race. In fact, you could probably make an argument if you're running 100 miles, you probably should not be crossing your aerobic threshold very often, or if at all, in most cases. So, I like to skew it a little more compartmentalized for these longer ones versus if I were going to do like a 50K or a 50 mile, I might blend intensities a little more because if I'm doing a 50 mile, I'm going to cross aerobic threshold. So I'm definitely battling different intensities a little more over the course of a race like that. But 100 miles is like the short intervals. I'll probably spend 4 to 6 weeks doing those in the 2 to 4 minute range, 1-to-1 work to rest ratio. So if it's 3 minutes, it's 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off. I'm usually working up to about 30 minutes or so of total volume per week at that short interval intensity. I often will break that into 2 sessions because I find for me, it makes it, for me and most people I've coached, less risk of injury because we're not compiling a ton of intensity into one session. I also find that I tend to get a little better quality when I have those 2 sessions because then that second block of say roughly 15 minutes is just going to have a little more quality to it because I'm not have the other 15 underneath it. But you can, I don't want to get in the weeds too much of this, but you can get some slight performance gains by blocking that together, making that bigger workout. The balance is always what's the opportunity cost for that? So if you do that and you end up inheriting 2 extra days of recovery because of it, then what did you lose by not doing something else that day? Or if you were going to do something similar to that day, what did you lose by the extra recovery that you could have done? And if that gets compounded over the course of a plan, how much fitness did you actually gain or lose? Right. So there's always this like opportunity cost question you want to be asking yourself. But then like short intervals, I phase into long intervals. So that's...
sorry to interrupt. When you're doing those intervals, do you say, okay, for this 2-minute section, I'm going to hit 6-minute pace? Or do you go like fartlek style, just more based off of feel?
Yeah, I'm pinning it to an intensity I can do for about 12 to 15 minutes in an all-out race day setting. Okay. So that's the intensity I'm looking for those. So when I start it, the pace for me is probably going to be somewhere in like the low 5-minute range. And then by the end of it, I'm probably going to be in the high 4-minute range for those. That's usually the kind of the trajectory when the adaptations start kicking in. I mean, you're looking at about 4 to 6 weeks for any physiological adaptation to really set in. So even though if I do say 2 per week, by the second week, I'm probably going faster. A lot of that is just like redialing in the perceived effort, getting better at the pacing, depending on where I'm doing it, just getting a little more comfortable with the route and just better execution, more or less, maybe some skeletal muscle adaptation, but like really the physiological adaptations that are going to make you more efficient from like just the way your body like utilizes oxygen and things like that are going to be like a 4 to 6 week window.
I'm glad you say that because a lot of people that I coach, it's like they're training for their first marathon ever. They've never heard of like easy days. They have the mindset of just like go out and run as hard as they can. And I tell everybody this is just from anecdotal evidence from my own. I've never actually looked into how long it takes physiologically, but it seems like about 4 to 6 weeks is like for their easy day paces to start dropping, heart rate to start dropping as well. And so that's reassuring to hear you say that.
Yeah. And when I coach this stuff, I always try to teach the person to pay attention to effort. So a lot of times we'll do a time trial of like 12 to 15 minutes just to give them that sensation of, oh, that's how fast I can run for 12 to 15 minutes. And then I tell them, think of that when you're doing these short intervals. And that should stay the same. Like I was saying before, the intensity remains constant, and we should see assuming the weather hasn't changed drastically, which, in Austin, that can be a question you need to ask yourself, or terrain. Like did you do the time trial on a track and now you're doing on a hilly, your Barton Hills or something like that. So you want to be mindful of the variables that are going to like impact that. But generally speaking, when you control as much as you can, you should see that pace improve at the intensity. And that can be a kind of a sign of progress, or something that when I'm coaching, that's what I'm looking for on the back end is, are we, like, some common questions, because communication is so huge with this, where because there's a difference between a client who hits a workout and feels like they had 1 or 2 left in tank versus a client who on paper hit the workout, which you can sometimes still see if they are not perfectly, I wouldn't say that they're lying, but they may just not be aware of like, okay, they were exhausted at the end of that. They could not have done another one. And if they had, it would have been way slower.
How do you judge that? Like looking at their heart rate data or just from what they say?
Yeah, it's a combination. So there's some data you can look at. Heart rate can be tricky, although it does get more accurate as the workout plays out. It's just the short intervals are the hardest with this, because there's like a catch-up period. So the heart rate doesn't necessarily, and it can actually, I discourage using heart rate as a guide for this is why I teach perceived effort, because if someone says, I'm going to do a short interval 2 minutes, let's say they're staring at heart rate based on their 12, 15 minute time trial, they should be, let's say they're supposed to be at like 185 beats per minute or something like that. And they go out there and they're 20 seconds in, they look down at their heart rate monitor and it says 159. They're like, shoot, I'm underachieving. So they throttle down, they blow way past the intensity. Heart rate eventually catches up, but it was like not a live feed guide that they should have been using at that point. Whereas if I'm looking at their GPX file post run, I can see that heart rate increase from interval to interval as they get further into the workout, and their resting heart rate doesn't come down quite as much. And they usually end up pretty close to their time trial heart rate by that last interval. But what I'm looking for to see if it was sustainable is, are they able to carry a consistent pace across this interval? Because it shouldn't be something where the first one's fast, next one's a little slower, next one's a little slower, next one's a little slower. It shouldn't be a thing where the beginning one is fast and then it gets slower throughout the interval. And it should, so like you want to see, like if you look at it on a graph, there's basically like when you get the 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, it's like this peak valley, peak valley. You want, like if you took a ruler and a perfect one, it'd be like a perfectly flat thing you could set on top of there and it'd be level. That would be like precision at its finest. If you took the level and the little bubble was like perfectly balanced there. So that's a lot what I'm looking at, but I'm always checking with them too, because you can execute a workout like that if you're really good at pacing and you know yourself, and do a little too much. So I definitely am always talking to them about, well, how did it feel? Did it feel like that last one was significantly harder? Did you feel like you could do more at the end? Like if I had let's say I sent them out before like 8 by 2 minutes or something like that, and then could you have done 9 or 10 if you had to? And if they're like, yeah, I could have. And I can usually tell by the graph if that's accurate or not to some degree, because chances are if it is that really clean graph and it matches up with their perceived effort, then you have 2 data points that are very much pointing in that direction. So, but it always tells itself over time too, because if they're overreaching consistently, eventually it's going to show up in the workouts, show up in the training, and then we course correct. And some of that's just part of it too. Like there's no perfect training plan. Like, I mean, I've never executed one, but
I don't think anybody has.
No. So there's going to be that kind of little bit of, and this is where the communication is also, I think, valuable between the coach and the client, is that having that person also just like talk to you about, did you just have a bad day because of this, that, or the other thing? Or was it because we're doing an interval or two too many and it's starting to catch up? And like, do we just move a deload week to account for that and then course correct so we can get a little more total volume over, say, a 3-week time frame than we would have otherwise, and make all these kind of little micro adjustments with them so that over the course of, say, 16, 24 weeks, it adds up to something that's meaningful enough to actually show up on the race course. Yeah. And then I think we were talking about the trajectory of 100-mile training, and then we were talking about time and distance, but then long intervals is kind of the next stage.
Right.
So that's it's similar structure to the short intervals in that it's an interval, but it's pinned to an intensity you could stay in for about 60 minutes in a race day setting.
What's the longest long interval you'll do?
20 minutes is usually the furthest I'll go. I don't like 20 minutes that much though. I find the sweet spot to be 8 to maybe 15 minutes.
That's basically like threshold pace.
Yep, exactly. Okay. Yep. I like 8 to 15 minutes as a kind of a good one. I find like just for myself and then just working with all the people I've worked with over the years, I find that if we're in 8 to 15 minute range, I'm more likely to consistently get that quality I'm looking for across intervals where I have fewer days where, let's say because for this, I'm targeting more overall volume during the week. We're getting closer to 60 minutes of total volume during the week for these, and sometimes more like 90, depending on the person's goals, their development, what they're able to tolerate, and things like that. And like if that person is like able to maintain that same like kind of like that same strategy of this one, like you don't necessarily want to be doing 2 more of these because it's like you might only be doing 2 by 15. So like you probably shouldn't be able to do 2 more. But I'm still asking from that same thing. Like, did you feel like you finished with nothing left in the tank versus if I sent you out for an extra interval, would you have been okay with that? So if it was 3 by 8, could you have done 4 by 8 or something like that?
Do you use like a RPE, like 1 out of 10 kind of system?
Yeah. So I put this on mine. I do have a 1 through 10 scale. So this would be like a 6 to 7 out of 10 on my scale. Okay. But it's right at their threshold. It's like I'm targeting lactate threshold essentially with these type of workouts. And it's kind of the same idea. I usually do 2 sessions per week, 4 to 6 weeks. And I'll probably leave threshold in the plan a little bit longer just because you're getting closer to race intensity the slower you get. So it's still speed work, but it's less catastrophic in the sense that the opportunity cost of these type of workouts don't tend to be as big. So like if I'm programming short intervals near the end of a plan, it's going to likely bleed into the quality of the stuff we should be focusing on more versus if I build someone up to be able to tolerate 60 plus minutes of threshold work per week, and then we start kind of heading into the back third of the plan and start building out their long run, I can probably keep an abbreviated threshold workout in there without too much opportunity cost. So like maybe they were doing 2 threshold sessions, 30 minutes each during when we were focusing on that versus now that we've established that we can maintain with much lower volume. So maybe I pull that back to say like 20, 30 minutes per week as we're going to build out their long run, or in some cases back-to-back long runs, and just kind of lean into lower intensity volume. But that's kind of the next step after we do the threshold adaptation stuff is like going into the long run development, which is what most of the ultra runners are there for.
Right. That's a super unique, at least to me, it sounds like a unique approach to training and maybe it's more because I'm just used to the marathon style where it's a lot of set distances using miles and meters and stuff. But is that something that you've kind of just like developed through your own training and like your own experiences, or it sounds like you probably do a lot of research and stuff like that, or did somebody teach you that, or where's all this knowledge kind of come from?
Yeah, nothing is unique to me. Like there's no like you have like the Daniels formula. There's no bitter formula. So it's all basically just looking at, I think once you find kind of like what is the goal intensity of a race, to me, it gets so much easier from there. Because from there, I think you just want to be doing, like what I said before, all the important things. And I think all these like short intervals, people sometimes think, why would I do short intervals for a 100-mile race? It's so different. And it's like, yeah, it is, but it's a piece to the puzzle that's going to improve your overall fitness. So if you're more fit going into the race specific training phase of the plan, then you're going to get higher quality training during the most important part of the plan. So that's not to say someone couldn't just say, okay, I'm just going to go run a lot of slow miles. That'll get you there. But you're going to do a lot of slow miles, and you're going to likely do a lot of them at a lower quality than what you could do if you adapted and got to be a better overall runner in general. So then it's just like what I was talking about before, opportunity cost, where I don't want a short interval session to be negatively impacting a long run, or just overall volume is probably a better way to look at it, because it's not like there's not a whole lot of value, in my opinion, from a physiological adaptation standpoint, to be doing like these like massive like 5, 6, 7, 8 hour long runs that you see some ultra runners do. I think there's some value in doing those. They're just not from a standpoint of I'm going to be gaining so much value in hours 6, 7, and 8 you're probably better off spreading that out, and you'll probably get more overall volume at that intensity over the course of weeks by not doing that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that seems to be like a very common thing, is like there's kind of a point of diminishing returns where
Yeah.
you're probably more so just risking injury or overtraining than what you're actually getting out of it.
The way I look at it is the biggest lever to pull is going to be the amount of volume spent at the goal intensity. So if your goal intensity is race pace and you have 8 weeks, whatever way you can get the most amount of volume and still properly recover from that is going to be the biggest lever to pull. From there, you can start getting a little bit more creative. So like because I mean, like we've talked about before, there's all these other aspects. I don't want people to come in now and think, if they listen to the first half of this podcast, they're like, oh, it's all mental. The second half, they're gonna be like, it's all physiological. But really, it's a balance between all these things. Right. And this is where the coaching and just the general like thought of the whole process kind of like comes into play to kind of figure out where the person needs to practice and don't. So let's say I have somebody who we have 8 weeks that we're going to spend like really developing their race intensity stuff. If I'm working with a person who's been through this process a dozen times, very injury resistant, so they've had like well-planned off seasons, but they haven't had any real setbacks. So their like trajectory in the sport has just been this nice little gradual increase over the years. And that person, we're going to be fine-tuning a lot of different stuff, most likely, because we want to prepare them to a lot more specific stuff to the race in a lot of cases. And so that might be like, I might send them out for an 8-hour long run if the race they're doing is going to be one where we need to know exactly how this gear setup, this nutrition strategy, this pacing strategy, how sustainable do we think this is going to be, all sorts of different things to get dialed in to make sure that we get an opportunity. Here's another one, an opportunity to actually go through some ups and downs. Because if I'm doing nothing but like 2.5 hour long runs and having more overall volume because of that, that may be good in one aspect. But if that doesn't put me in a position to be able to go through those ebbs and flows of the long day, and I buckle under that, then I should have probably done some longer sessions where I learned how to navigate that. And
so do you think that's where like that's more mental training, would you say?
To a large degree, mental training, nutrition training, gear training, understanding how your body changes over a changing temperature, because these races are done throughout the course of a day. So you have Western States 100 is a perfect example of this, where you can have snow in the high country. It can be like literally like in the 30, 40 degree frame in some spots of that course. Then you can get in the canyons. Some years it's 100 degrees in there, and you can have that all in the same day. So like you have to know like, or you should have an idea of like, when I hit those warmer temperatures, when I leave the aid station, I should have this, that, and the other thing. Or when I'm up in the high country in the cooler weather, one piece of equipment might be the difference between you feeling good and therefore not burning a bunch of mental energy, stressing out, and just actually taking care of yourself. And I think that's where like trying to bridge that gap between where like the real physiological adaptations of a long run end and just more time on feet add up can be useful. There's also like the component of like most of these 100-milers, especially the trail ones, there's a hiking component even for the people winning these things. So let's say I'm working with someone where their time goal is, I want to break 24 hours in 100 miles. Well, when you just do the math on that, that's an average of a brisk walk. So obviously there's probably a lot of climbing and descending. Like that race you're going to do in Wyoming probably has a lot of up and down in it, I'm guessing. So like it's not quite as like clean as thinking, okay, I'm just going on the sidewalk, I'm going to walk 4.1 or 2 miles per hour. Right. It's a little bit different. Yeah, a little different. But generally speaking, like I think looking at it through that lens is important, because most people, when they go out for even their easy run, are probably going to be going faster than that. Right. So what that does is it spells this, or what that tells me is, if we're going to actually practice the things you're doing on race day, we need you to be doing the things you're going to do on race day, which means hiking and running. So if we look at like the curve of like benefits for the long run, once you start getting to 3 hours, closer to 4 hours, that curve goes from like pretty good improvements to like almost a flat line where the risk reward is skewed heavily towards risk. I don't have a problem with people going past that. I think you just want to be mindful of when you go past that, you should be going race intensity, not your typical, what people would maybe think of as a long run intensity. So that might just mean 5 hour long run in quotes, but 3 hours of that's running, 2 hours of that's hiking. So you get that experience of being out there, but you get it at race intensity, which is even more valuable. Because now you're practicing your gear, practicing your nutrition, practicing your hydrating, maybe topical cooling at the actual intensity you're going at too. So it's kind of a win across all spectrums when you back up and actually slow your long run down when you're going beyond that 3-4 hour time frame to what you're going to do on race day.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. I definitely wanted to ask you about the nutrition side of things, because are you still keto, low carb?
Yeah. I've been doing the way I like to describe this, because it gets so confusing to people, I think, where they hear keto and some people will think that's just kind of like generally low carb, whereas other people will think it's no carb. So like what I'll say is like a strict ketogenic diet or a very low carbohydrate diet is like a pretty aggressive formula where you're looking at like probably 30 to 50 grams of carbohydrate or less per day. For all intensive purposes, it's basically no carbohydrate, because once you get around to adding like any even non-starchy vegetable to your diet, you're going to get to 30 grams pretty quick.
Right. It's like a banana.
Yeah, exactly. It is a banana. Yeah. So so it's basically the removal of what most people would think of as a carbohydrate source.
Okay.
I don't do that very often. I will flex in a strict ketogenic diet once in a while, like in an off season, if I'm doing like 4 weeks unstructured after like a big racing season or something like that. Sometimes I'll do something close to that. Once I get into training, I'm doing what I would call a low carbohydrate diet, which has a lot more range to it. So a low carbohydrate diet, essentially, as I'm going to define it, is anything like above strict ketogenic to a point where your fats are still the primary macronutrient when you also add in the protein and carbohydrate side. So for me, sometimes that means I'm taking in more carbohydrates than other times. I tend to take in more carbohydrate around the times of training when I'm doing short intervals and long intervals, because those are the ones where I find like, and I think the research would suggest this as well, that it's going to be some benefit to have carbohydrate. I think you can get a lot more creative than most people do, where they just think of like carbohydrate as this has to be the foundation of my nutrition. Whereas if you just get a little more strategic about where you're placing it, you can probably do more with less. But less is going to be relative to the person. So I might be doing a little more carbohydrate than I normally would, or what my yearly average would be is maybe one way to look at it during those short interval, long interval phases. Once I get into long run development stuff and I'm keeping things mostly around my aerobic threshold or below, that part of the year I can sort of lean into lower. I'm still not going strict ketogenic at that point, because I definitely still want to use carbohydrates on race day. So I'm not looking for that trade-off of significantly down-regulating my body's ability to use exogenous carbohydrates either. But I also recognize that fuel source isn't as necessary as it was when I was trying to hit that VO2 max or lactate threshold intensity earlier in the plan. So I'm still like, I have kind of like a seasonal, I guess, or like a phase of nutrition where it's all kind of under this low carb umbrella, but where under there is going to kind of shift depending on where the focus is in training. And really my goal with that on race day is improve fat oxidation rates to the degree where I can minimize carbohydrate intake during the day to what I consider a manageably digestible amount. So one of the things with ultramarathons is, if you look at the research on just the fueling side of it, which is a big piece to this puzzle, I think, right. You get, and then just fueling in the marathon too, but it's really when you get to ultramarathon where like eating becomes a huge component of what's going to happen on race day. So I find for me, if I'm at around 40 grams of carbohydrate per hour, I can get that in most conditions without having any gastrointestinal issues. When I start pushing past that, that's where it starts to get where like, all right, if it's past 50 miles or like 6-7 hours, it starts getting a little more shaky. It gets up to 100 miles. It's like I'm rolling the dice. And that's where a lot of people are. Because if you look at the research on gastrointestinal issues with single-day ultramarathoners, we're looking at about a 50% experience with that. And that's going to range from severe to mild. Mild, most people are going to have to some degree and probably be able to tolerate it. Severe, that's puking up gels, just shitting out your nutrition, right? like that. Like the stuff you don't want to be doing. Yeah. It's going to take time off your finish for sure, or add time to your finish for sure.
And just going to be a miserable experience.
Yeah, because you're not actually processing a lot of that. Right. So you have like an upper GI and lower GI distress, and upper GI is going to probably come out the front end. Lower GI is probably coming out the back end.
Do you do fruit or like solid foods or gels, or what do you normally do for carbs during a race?
Yeah, combination. So like I like it to use like a sports product as like part of it because it's just easy. It's liquid or gel based, so it's quick, it's convenient. Once you start getting to the 100-mile distance, though, I think you want a blend of solids and liquid gel stuff.
What gels do you typically use?
I use a company called S Fuels. They make
I haven't heard of them.
Yeah, they're relatively new. They're interesting. They actually fit my lifestyle perfectly because they're a low carbohydrate lifestyle brand.
Oh, nice.
But they work with they do a lot of research for their product with this guy named Dr. Dan Plews out of New Zealand. He's like the age group world record holder for Kona.
Okay.
He's like a half full Ironman guy. He's got an exercise phys lab, and he kind of has a similar nutrition strategy to me. So the whole like catalog is kind of built around kind of my strategy or the strategy I use, which is like a foundation in fat and then like right fuel at right time where you bring in the carbohydrates. So they have like their protein stuff. They have their lifestyle bars that are going to skew low carb. And then they have like they have a powder that's basically a low carb powder too. Their Race Plus and Race Plus Gel is what I'm going to use on race day because that's going to be their carbohydrate-based stuff.
Do you know what it's made out of? The ingredients?
For the Race Plus?
Yeah, for the gels.
Oh, like if it's fructose or glucose type
combinations? Yeah, because I use Spring. And it's all like whole foods, which is great.
Yeah. I'd have to pull up their exact formula to tell you like precisely how their split goes. But the way to think about it is like when you're looking at any of these nutrition, there is a digestibility like game you can play. I don't have to play it that precisely because I'm not hitting these like thresholds in most cases. Although I should say, because what you're looking at is a formula of where the research is now. There's definitely people testing. I'm one of them testing on either side of this. Is like you have 60 grams of glucose. That pathway is what your body can kind of digest before you start bottlenecking, and your body's like, okay, more's coming in than we can process.
Is that like per hour or
per hour? Yeah,
okay.
Per hour. And then you have 30 grams of fructose.
Okay.
So they're different pathways though.
Interesting.
Yeah. So you can get a double dip there if you want, and you could do 90 grams per hour if you combine those two. This is all in the lab. So like, there's, as we know, the lab and the field don't always match, which is why sometimes people do 90 grams and get to the finish line unscathed, and other people do 90 grams and they show up in the porta potty.
What are examples? You said it was fructose and then
glucose and fructose.
Okay.
Yeah. So
what are examples of those two sources?
So basically, if you think of like glucose is just basically pure sugar.
Okay.
And then fructose is going to be like the fruit based.
Okay.
Yeah. So most sports products are going to do a 2-to-1 blend of those because they know the research. And the last thing a nutrition brand wants is for you to take their product and have a digestive issue.
Right. That's fair enough.
Yeah. So they tend to follow that stuff pretty precisely. So like, I bet you if you brought up Spring's gels, they would probably reflect something similar to that. So Single Day Ultra is going to recommend 50 to 70 grams per hour if you're following a moderate carbohydrate diet, which they would recommend. And then from there, they would recommend a process of kind of a mixture between a sports product and a solid food. And that's just going to help with digestion over the course of the long haul.
What do you normally do for solids?
I'll do so I like to contrast what I'm having from a texture and a flavor standpoint, because there's also this thing called palate fatigue, where like you just kind of get sick of doing the same thing over and over again. It could be your favorite thing too. So if I'm doing like a liquid gel based thing for my sports product, it's a little sweeter tasting, it's wet gel. So I'm going crunchy, salty, more savory. So it can be something as simple as a salty cracker or a pretzel, that sort of consistency. The way I structure is I have plan A, plan B. So my plan A is going to be the S Fuels Race Plus. Plan B is going to be the solid food. So that's going to be like something like a salty cracker. Plan C, I'm going to have as kind of like a backup for all of this, where I look at the aid stations and what they have available at the race I'm doing and start figuring out, okay, what are my options? So that in training, I can practice some of those too. So if I get to a point where sometimes it's just pure like psychological to a degree, where it's like, all right, I'm coming into this aid station. This thing looks good and I want that instead. And if it's something I can look forward to and that helps me stay positive, because the whole idea is stay positive. So like if I'm 2 miles out from an aid station and for whatever reason, like that half strip of bacon and that slice of watermelon is just going to get me motivated to focus on that aid station versus the next 30 miles after that, then I'm going to go into that aid station with the intent of using plan C and grabbing that half strip of bacon and slice of watermelon. So
You try to be self-sufficient as much as possible, though.
Mm-hmm.
Just rely on your own stuff.
Yeah, because that's the stuff that you can practice and you can sort of like stress test more in training to a degree. Yeah. So yeah, practicing in your long runs is an important aspect, I think. You get the intensity specific to what you're going to do on race day. So you get an idea of like what sits in your stomach at that intensity well. Since it's a longer run, your chances are you're going to cross more weather patterns during that course of that. So you can kind of see what is the difference between this sitting my stomach in room temperature versus being a little hotter. What kind of combinations am I going to want from a hydration standpoint when I'm eating this versus that? All sorts of different things like that. Just it's kind of like a practice what you're going to do on race day versus doing something new. I mean, I think you can roll the dice a little bit on race day with aid station stuff if it looks good, like that example I had before. I think you just want to be kind of careful where what looks like the right amount might be like 2, 3, 4 times as much as you should start with. So, so like here's an example, like going to an aid station. Oh, that peanut butter jelly sandwich looks good. I'm gonna have it. You rifle it down, and then you realize as you're leaving the aid station, oh, I ate too much. You don't want that experience either. So I say, if you're gonna do something like that, take it with you and start nibbling on it. And nibbling is generally going to be a better idea anyway. So nibble on it. If it sits well in your stomach, you're like, okay, that was what I thought it was going to be. And you just keep nibbling on it so that you're not, overextending yourself either. Yeah. I mean, the nutrition side is crazy. I think with ultramarathon running, because the intensity is so low, it just opens the door to a lot more variety. So my recommendation with people is like, first of all, unless you're really curious about, like, some people are just really curious about low carb because they're like, oh, I like the idea of not having to try to focus on eating as much during the race itself. Some people just, I think dietary like culture, especially online, is just hilarious because it's like people trying to tell everyone what the best way to eat is and that everyone should be doing this or whatever they're doing. When in reality, I think it's more of like, what is a way of eating that you can sustain at the individual level? Like you got to be able to do this over and over again. So find something that you can actually do versus something that you visualize as being cool or great, but then by week 3 you're no longer adhering to it because it's not sustainable for your particular personality or whatever.
Right.
And the nice thing about ultra running is you sort of get that, where from when I started ultra running, it was very much in that same mindset of just like, carbs are king. Everything should be based around carbohydrate. And if not moderate, certainly high, that sort of or if not high, certainly moderate kind of a mindset. And most people are probably going to be moderate carbohydrate. So it's probably a good place to start. I mean, that's where I started. I didn't have any issues really with using carbohydrate when I was racing in college and the shorter stuff and things like that. So like, I think like most people, the way I explain it is if you just blindfolded yourself and went into a grocery store and just started grabbing stuff off the shelf randomly, you'd probably end up in the moderate carb category. Mm-hmm. Most people are probably not putting a ton of thought into that. So they're probably moderate carbohydrate.
Yeah.
So you can start with that and then kind of see where you go. Where I think it gets interesting is if you're thinking moderate carbohydrate is going to need about a 50 to 70 gram per hour frequency. If you're there's going to be the range of people who can do that. There's going to be a range of people who can go well above that and be just fine. And there's going to be people who struggle mightily to get anywhere near that. And they're going to be the ones on that where I was talking about before, where like 50% of the people have some sort of gastrointestinal issue. Of that 50%, it's about a 50-50 between like modest to severe. So we're looking at like a quarter to a third of the people are going to have some sort of severe gastrointestinal issue during the course of the day. So my theory is that group of people likely have two options. They either have to train themselves to be able to eat at that frequency and not get those issues, or they need to adhere to a dietary practice that allows them to eat what they're currently eating and not have the performance dips that they're going to get by not hitting that 50 to 70 grams. So a lot of times that's where my starting point is with people when I'm coaching. If someone's like, hey, I'm interested in this, what do you think? Or maybe sometimes they'll just straight up ask, like, should I switch to a low carbohydrate diet? And I'm like, well, let's look. We look at their diet and they're like, let's say they're 60% carbohydrate. They've done 7 ultra marathons, 200 milers, and they've never had a digestive issue. Probably not going to switch with them unless they're doing all these and they tell me I haven't had any digestive issues, but I'm only getting in 30 grams per hour. Then we might say, okay, we've got two options here. We can try to stress that up to 50 to 70 You can try that, see if that works, because that's probably going to produce a better performance for you on a moderate carbohydrate diet. Or if we suspect or eventually learn that 30, 40 grams is kind of their limit, they're just not going to get past that without really getting risky, then they may be better off kind of just having a foundation of their diet in fat and less in carbohydrate in order to kind of lower that need for them on race day and ease the burden of the logistics and hopefully the gastrointestinal stuff.
Yeah, the nutrition thing is just so subjective to every single person. That's why it's always a horrible idea to just blindly see some influencer on Instagram eating a bunch of stuff or recommending stuff and just go out and try it during a race or something. That's obviously a bad idea.
The nice thing now with ultramarathon is they're getting, I think, a little bit more to the point where they're not being too dogmatic in either direction, at least when you get people, when you actually sit down and unpack the nuance of it and get past just kind of like the surface level, like argument stuff. And it's more like, they're kind of like, get enough protein, like, hit your protein targets, hit your energy intake targets, like don't undereat. like that's going to be more problematic than whatever. Like if you're under eating consistently and you're underweight, like that's going to be a bigger lever to fix than any macronutrient ratio is going to be. So from there, it's like, then it's like, whatever your balance is between fats and carbohydrates is probably sort of irrelevant at first, unless like that stuff I said before becomes present to you, where maybe you're someone like myself where I struggle to hit like 70 grams of carbohydrate, 50 grams of carbohydrate in some cases for longer efforts. And generally speaking, I like the lifestyle too. So like from a sustainability standpoint, the repetition day in and day out of the way of eating I have it just works well for me. So some people will be on the opposite end of that spectrum though, and they'll be like, I really want 70% of my intake coming from carbohydrate. So for them, like their lifestyle has to match it. So
what got you into low carb to begin with?
Yeah, I started at the end of 2011. I had done my first kind of full season of ultramarathon running, and I just didn't find my approach, and this was probably multifactorial, didn't feel sustainable to keep doing it the way I was. And I hadn't done 100 miles yet at the time. And it certainly inter-race didn't feel sustainable, where I'd finish a 50 miler and I wasn't having like severe digestion issues or anything, but I was finishing them thinking like, there's no way I'm fueling like that for 100 miles. And I wasn't going crazy. I wasn't pushing like 90, 100, 110 grams that you do see sometimes. I was very much in that 50 to 70 gram range, probably closer to 60 than 50, and maybe at times up to 70, but I wasn't exceeding that. And it was just like, it didn't feel sustainable to be able to kind of repeat that. So I was heading into an off season, and I had an opportunity to just play around with some nutrition stuff, because my other piece of advice is like, don't throw a wrench in your nutrition if something's working relatively well in the middle of your training, or right before your goal race or something like that. If you're going to try to make this switch, ideally start it in the off season when you have like some time to do some unstructured stuff, and then ease into the structured stuff again. Because if you add a dietary stress on top of the physical stress, you're sort of you're pulling that stress lever in multiple directions. So replace it when you reduce the training stress of your life. That's the opportunity you have to maybe take on the dietary shift stresses that are gonna take anytime you like shift your macronutrient targets to a large degree. So I did that. I was really fortunate. I got in contact with a couple of guys, Dr. Jeff Volek and Dr. Stephen Finney, who've been kind of like the guys who really spurred low carbohydrate, at least around performance, kind of in this last round of it anyway, a round of research. So I got to get to know them and some of their work and get some pointers from them. And there's probably a dozen mistakes I would have made had I not been able to hear what those guys had to say. But I mean, I started out following a pretty strict ketogenic diet, thinking, okay, well, this is the lifestyle switch. I went into it thinking not knowing what was going to happen. So I was pretty open to adjust if I needed to. And I got through 4 weeks of my off season feeling pretty good with it. I wasn't doing much training, not structured anyway. And But things were going pretty smooth after 4 weeks. It wasn't until I kind of got into the phase of training where I started reintroducing some speed work, where I felt like, then I felt like I was like, I feel great at like that aerobic threshold range, and I can maybe do like a speed session here and there. But I felt like a lot of times if I was repeating a speed session in the time frame that I wanted to, I was feeling a little flat in those, or like I couldn't quite throttle down to that last gear. So then I started just bringing back some carbohydrate. I didn't go like full scale back to moderate carbohydrate. I just brought back some. And as long as I put it kind of in the right place, it seemed to kind of more or less like normalize that for me, where I was still able to hit like my splits for my speed work and things like that. And it was just being a little more conscious about like, there's a difference between strict keto and just general low carb. And for my lifestyle, in most cases, I think general low carb is probably going to be more of a benefit.
Yeah, it seems like there's kind of a shift or more of a movement. People like yourself and like Mike McKnight that are really pushing the low carb diet. And it seems like for ultra running, it really just reduces a lot of the variables and it makes you more consistent with the diet. Is if you, I don't know if you ever have any intentions to like going down in mileage for races, like doing a marathon or like half marathon or anything. But if you did, would you still continue doing the low carb approach, or would you have to increase for those faster speeds?
It's a good question. I think the way I see this is I think there are people out there who probably would run their fastest time on a low carbohydrate diet in the marathon or shorter, but I don't think it's because that's optimal. I think like they are probably, it's just there's some individual characteristic about them that makes, it could be something as simple as the low carbohydrate diet is sustainable for them at the individual level, and that allows them to stay consistent with their training, stay consistent with their intake goals and all that stuff. Versus like once we get to like Olympic level marathoners, you will never see a strict ketogenic or likely even like a relatively low carbohydrate Olympic marathon champion, because that intensity is so precise. It's like it's gotten whittled down to where it's basically a 2-hour time trial now. Right. These guys are racing that 2 hours at around mid to low 90% their lactate threshold, which for the average person is going to be intensity they could sustain for about 60 minutes. Like that's what I'm pinning that to. So they're just under that intensity for nearly 2 hours. So they have trained themselves into an intensity that they can almost double their ability to sustain it. And that's like, you know, it's such the oxygen demand that you're getting for that is going to be something that just requires a quicker access to fuel source. And that's going to be carbohydrate. I think once you start looking at these things as tools versus good or bad, you start seeing these things in the way that I think is more useful for people, where like, if I were to try to perfect my marathon time, get as low as I possibly could, I'd never get to a 2-hour marathon, but I could probably get down to the low 220s and dip under into the high 2 teens, somewhere in there.
Do you have any desire to do that?
I do, but it's like, it's an opportunity cost thing at this point too, where it's like, I do always wonder, because I sort of skipped the marathon. I went like 5Ks, 10Ks in college. I did some marathons, but they were like, none of them were like overly structured in the way I prepared for them. So, and then by the time I was 24, I was doing ultras, but I would like to, just maybe give like one big build up for one and just see where it lands. And if it's like close enough to low 220, maybe take a couple more swings if that kind of timeline works out with like a goal 100 miler or something down the road. But yeah, to kind of answer your question, I think like assuming like that, from a general standpoint, like every other marker clears out as being positive, then I think like, yeah, I would certainly be increasing my carbohydrate above and beyond what I would do for 100 milers. Where that number would end, I don't know for sure, but it would probably be in the moderate carbohydrate category, I would imagine.
Okay.
But yeah, like you get where it gets interesting, I think, is you get people that have like a bunch of variables in their lifestyle that are not finely tuned the way a professional runner's is. So you get like a Kipchoge type individual where in order for him to be the best in the world and maintain that, everything has to be sort of optimized, and like you really can't have a weakness in the key areas. So someone who struggles with carbohydrate consumption to the level that Kipchoge does is just never going to be a world-class marathoner.
Right.
So it's sort of the sport probably selects for people who are going to be more inclined to be able to live that lifestyle too, to some degree. There's actually a research study that just came out. I think it creates about as many questions as answers, but it does make there's some really interesting data from it. And they looked at these, I think they were middle-aged men who were like relatively competitive in their age group category, training for endurance events. And they actually had them do they were on a moderate carbohydrate diet. They did a washout period and then a low carbohydrate diet. They did it for a longer duration. So it was like 4 weeks, and then they did a test. So that's important because a lot of the low carbohydrate research to date that shows it's got a deficit relative to moderate high carb has been done on a shift while they're also increasing training load to some degree. So you sort of get this, like what I was talking about before, this combination of stressors that are going to add an extra variable for that arm.
Right.
So everyone's always asking for these longer studies. And I get why they don't do them. I mean, they're incredibly expensive. Every researcher is going to be like, we have 100 questions to answer, but we can only pick 3. That's usually kind of the type of way to think about these things. So this one was actually probably a follow-up to some of the really good like research on this topic in the past, just to kind of help supplement that. And what they noticed within that was that of the 10 participants, or I think it was either 10 or 20, I'd have to go back and look, but it's 30% of them actually had fasting blood sugar levels like in the pre-diabetic range.
Oh, wow.
And they weren't gaining weight or anything like that. In fact, everyone, I think there was actually weight loss amongst both the low carb and the high carb trials, but they were relatively the same. So they could kind of control for that. It wasn't like one gained, one lost, one stayed the same, one lost. It was, they both lost a slight amount of weight, which is a great kind of outcome for the researchers, because now it rules out like, weight gain or things that can impact performance or things that could impact a lot of the quality of the research. They also more or less controlled for things like protein and things like that to a large degree. I think they introduced more sodium for the low carb group, because that was another complaint a lot of the low carbers had with some of the research to date, was like, you need to add more electrolytes for the low carb group. But yeah, so like, I guess what I'm trying to say with that is like, when you just look at the general population, if you happen to fall, let's say like that research is replicated and we can extrapolate it out, and it turns out 30% of fit, relatively like high quality age group level runners are going to be a pre-diabetic blood sugar level if they're following a moderate high carbohydrate diet. That suggests that there is a percentage of the population that from a health standpoint probably is going to do better off on some version of carbohydrate restriction that's going to bring that blood glucose average down into the below pre-diabetic levels or ranges.
Interesting.
Yeah. But this kind of just highlights the individuality of it, because it's not like, I don't want people to walk away thinking, oh, carbohydrates are going to make me go pre-diabetic if I start running. It's like, because there's still 7 out of 10 people who are perfectly fine. Right. So it's like, it just goes to show you, like, I think like the more you can look inside yourself, the more you can kind of start to piece together where are things that I know I need to do that are kind of universal versus things I can tweak for myself to optimize. And then ultimately, like, performance versus health, where do those things, I think those things interact with one another in a good way a lot of times. I think, training and exercise and a lot of that stuff is, performance is going to usually improve health too. But when you get into getting into the very high end of performance, that's not necessarily the case. And then when you get to the individual level, there are going to be some trade-offs, I think, for the average person versus like a person who is like an Olympic marathoner, world-class endurance athlete, and has sort of been selected by the sport to some degree to kind of have all these things available to them. And that's part of the reason why they're there. Yeah.
It's so incredibly subjective. I can even tell for myself, like if I'm in the middle of a marathon prep and like I've got several like big marathon long runs, and I have to carb load like the day before, 2 days before, like the weeks following when I have lower carb intake, I feel like shit because like my body, I'm just shoveling like 500-600 grams of carbs in a day.
Yeah.
So it gets so used to that high carb. And as soon as you take it away, you just feel terrible.
Yeah.
But then like in between races, like now, like I'm for the most part low carb, doing some like ultras this summer, and my energy levels are way more consistent. I feel healthier. I'm definitely leaner. Like I just feel way better as a whole on low carb.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I always wonder, because it's gotten popular and fatty enough, fad-y, not fatty, although it's gotten fatty too. Yeah. That like you do have people probably just like, following a real messy low carb and then bailing out, because like there is a transition. I think most people are aware of that now, that they need to give it at least like some time for that like metabolic switch to occur.
It's about a month or so, right?
Yeah, like well, okay, so there's a couple things to probably say about that. There's the fat oxidation rates actually come up very quickly, like in the matter of days sometimes. And someone has trained a lot in their life, or currently training a lot, it's probably gonna happen faster, because you can improve fat oxidation rates through a variety of different ways, like reducing carbohydrates, just one of them. It tends to be a more potent one. But someone who, let's say you go on a run in the morning without eating anything, you're going to improve your fat oxidation. Well, you're going to improve your fat oxidation rates even if you eat before that run to some degree. But if you start kind of pulling all these levers, you can improve them more and more. So like carbohydrate placing can improve fat oxidation rates. Fasted runs can improve fat oxidation rates. The big lever is going to be reducing the carbohydrate. So if you take someone, let's say like we took like yourself, you've been training for 2 years, you're on a moderate carbohydrate diet, and then we put you on a low carbohydrate diet, you're going to have improved fat oxidation rates in days. But there's other things that are going to likely play into how that plays out from a performance standpoint than just like that shift in your fat oxidation rates. So I think people probably want to be looking at like a 4 to maybe 8 week like adherence before they should start necessarily like deciding whether it was a good or bad idea, which is why off season is a great time to start it, because you kind of have that ramp. And I would say after like 4 to 8 weeks, if you're feeling miserable, like at that point, it's like, unless you have like unless you're working with a doctor or something and they're suggesting like this is something you need to do for some other health purpose or something like that, like I don't know that you should necessarily be forcing it at that point. Because one of the cool things for me anyway about this approach that I do is I've been doing it long enough now where I've seen so many people try it and talk to me about their experience with it, where like I have this like data set of just like, what are people actually doing, and like who's it working for and who's it not working for. And I haven't gotten like a definitive like, oh, everyone should switch to a low carbohydrate diet. That's just optimal for every person, or it should be the starting point. My view with nutrition is like I call this my nutrition utopia, would be we get away from like, first thing we do is we get away from like, this is the diet for everyone. That's step one. Then step two is like, what are like maybe a dozen to at most 24 like dietary patterns that are popular enough that people are actually going to like give them any time of day. Once we have those, let's fine tune them as much as possible. And then when someone decides, hey, I want to dial in my nutrition, I want to pay attention to my nutrition, it's like, okay, we're bringing out this catalog of options here. Which one of these looks like it's the types of foods that you could eat sustainably? And then we can probably narrow that down to like 2, 3, or 4 of those. And then from there, we start playing around within them. And I think like that's kind of like the way that it would be able to kind of figure out like both what's actually going to be something someone can stick to versus like, who's more likely to kind of have a good experience versus a bad experience with it.
Yeah, ditching the whole food pyramid bullshit that everybody is raised to come to learn. Like, this is how your diet has to be, otherwise it's wrong. Yeah. Which is obviously that's a whole nother conversation, I think. Yeah. But what is a day in the life of Zach look like? Eating, training, what does all that look like right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like now that I've been in Austin for a year and a half, I sort of have it finely tuned to some degree. So like usually what I'll do is I'll wake up in the morning. One of the funny things is I've historically been an early morning person. I think that started actually like when I was teaching, because I'd get up super early, like 4:30 to train. And that sort of carried over. But since moving to Austin, I still do some early mornings, but I also have some days where I'm sleep. I've sort of kind of matched sunrise a lot closer over the last few years, where like if it's like an early sunrise time of year, I'm probably going to be waking up a little earlier. So like this time of year, I'm up usually 5:36, a little earlier. Whereas in the winter, like I can kind of gravitate more towards sleeping in a little bit more. Right. The framework of my day, I'm completely self-employed now, so I can kind of build it out the way I want, which is nice. So I can kind of shift things around to match that to some degree, but that kind of the framework in there usually kind of fits the same way, regardless of whether it's a little earlier or a little later in the morning. But I get up, I'll have a cup of coffee or tea or something like that, and maybe a little bit of calories, usually not that much, because I'm usually going to do my bigger training session first thing in the morning, and I don't really like a lot in my stomach. If it's going to be a longer session, or if I just happen to wake up hungry, then I'll eat a little bit more, or I'll bring some fuel along with me for that training session.
What will you eat that first thing in the morning typically?
Usually it's something kind of a little more like a liquid calorie type of stuff. So it could be something as simple as like cream in my coffee, or maybe like some protein powder in the coffee with the cream or something like that. Maybe some nut butter or something like that if I'm looking to add a little more calories. When I get into my peak training phase, it's just such calorie demanding. It's like I kind of got to just be more aware of sneaking them in when you have opportunities so that I'm not getting behind on that. But yeah, a lot of like, one of my favorite ones, actually, I'll take like a half jar of like nut butter or like peanut butter, and I'll fill the rest, have like extra virgin olive oil and stir it up. So it's like this really watery, just like
interesting,
super calorie dense.
How'd you come up with that?
I think, I accidentally came up with it, and I'm sure other people have done something similar to this, but you know how when you get like the peanut butter and it has the oil on the top?
Right.
So I would like stir that, but I would never stir it like well enough. So then I'd get to like the last third, and it would be like this rock hard, like peanut, like dust essentially. So I would just pour oil in there to kind of like remedy that. And then I got to this point where like, the consistency of more oil is actually like both higher calorie and so I'll do that. Like if I need extra calories before I'm heading out, that's something I'll do a couple like spoonfuls of that.
I'm gonna have to try that.
I like that. It's great. Yeah, when you get into full on ultra training, just load up a couple of jars of that.
Is olive oil, is that like your go-to for cooking and that kind of stuff too?
Yeah. Olive oil. I mean, I've gone through phases. Like, so I've done the same kind of macronutrient type targets since 2011 for the most part. It took me maybe like a year and a half, 2 years to really dial that in. But then since then, that stayed the same. But the inputs have been like super wide ranging from like mostly plant-based to mostly animal products.
Oh, you tried plant-based?
Not like 100%. I've never been like 100% vegan or even probably like vegetarian technically. But I've been where like 95% of my intake is plant-based within kind of low carb. And it's just very few like animal
that's
products.
Not a lot you can eat.
No, it's hard. Well, you're leaning into a lot of oils and nuts and seeds at that point for sure. And then I've done everything where I'm like upwards to like almost 90% animal product and then very little plant stuff. So I'm usually kind of more mixed. Okay. But I've one thing that I find that makes it exciting for me is like once I get the macronutrients like targets ranged, the inputs I can kind of play around with and find like what I enjoy. And it also, I think, is part of the reason why I'm able to do it as long as I have, is because if I get sick of one pattern of eating, it's like, well, let's just try. Right. And as long as it doesn't like create any issues for me, then I can kind of keep doing it for a while until I get sick of that one and move on to the next. But yeah, I mean, extra virgin olive oil is more or less for the most part been around for a huge portion of my low carb journey. It's just a great way to get those extra calories in. The way I like to do it though is like I'll build out like something that's closer to maybe like 2,000 calories that checks all the micronutrient targets, the protein targets and things like that. And then like that's kind of resting metabolic needs. And then I know I kind of got all the like the essentials checked off. And then from there I can just add to that based on energy demands. So then I get to the point where like, I'm doing like 30-mile long run, that extra virgin olive oil bottle and the half jar of nut butter comes out and start mixing that to catch up. But I mean, there's other things too. Like I'll use this product called S-Field's Life Bars. It's like about a 200 calorie like protein bar, low carb. Sometimes I'll have like one of those, like if I'm heading out the door quick for a long, slow run and I need a little fuel.
What's your training volume right now?
Well, right now I'm coming off an injury, so it's skewed. Okay. It's skewed away from running. Actually, my volume is actually getting pretty high right now because I've been doing a lot of cycling and sled pushing. I actually I had a stress fracture on my right sacral ala, which is
what is that?
It's like your tailbone essentially.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so there's a variety of different ways you can fracture that general area of your body. The one I have is actually about as good as it gets. It's basically a 4 to 6 week bone remodeling process.
Is that from running?
Yeah, it happens. So I've had 2 bone injuries in my life, both stress fractures on my right sacral ala. So now that I've done it a second time, I'm looking at like, I'm just unturning everything just to make sure, because of repetitive stuff like that, you want to, I mean, granted, the first time I did it was 6 years ago. So it's not like it was it wasn't like super reoccurring in the sense that it was like I heard it, then a year later it came back again.
Right.
I think like the main reason that happens a lot of times is when you change your training environment without reducing training load. So the first time I did it, it was I was training for a flat ultra, and then I got kind of late into the Western States 100. So I took that because it's a hard race to get into, and I just transferred training load over to hilly stuff, and then I got that stress fracture. This time I think I might have aggravated it by I was training for a flat ultra this time. It was gonna be on a track, so I was starting to build up my long run on the track. So I was progressively lengthening my track long run. But this time, I think the mistake I made was I should have probably added more track work earlier in the plan to kind of close that gap a little bit better. And then usually I'll turn periodically throughout those long runs on the track just to switch direction. This time I didn't because I was doing it at Austin High, and they kind of have like, there's enough people out there where you don't really want to be running against stream.
Right.
So I was just like going the same way, and that was probably a bad idea. But I don't know that it was necessarily just that. I think these things probably have multiple inputs to versus just that. I don't think it was just the track that caused it. So like I've been like turning over everything, like bone scans and things like that, just to make sure like I'm not deficient in anything and checking all those boxes. And so far I'm almost 5 weeks in now. So I've been reintroducing running this week, but doing a lot of sled pushing and cycling along with it.
You just do like sled pushes like for
yeah,
hours?
I got one of those torque tanks, the mini torque tanks.
I don't know if I've seen those.
Yeah, they're sweet. It's got the pull strap and the push
Is it on
strap.
Wheels?
Yeah.
Oh, I think I have seen those. Okay.
Yeah. So our driveway is probably like, I've got like a stretch where I can go like maybe like 15 meters. So I just push 15 and then pull back, push 15 and pull back.
How long will you do that for?
I've done up to 90 minutes in a day, but
Wow.
I've never done more than an hour in one setting or one.
Damn. So just
back
consistent
and forth
the whole time. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I think once I'm fully healed and back up to full training, I'm going to do some trail stuff for about a year or so.
Your legs are going to be jacked after all this.
That's what I'm
stuff.
hoping for. Yeah. I'm hoping it's going to be useful. My assumption is like, it's going to be two valuable things. One is going to be like uphill running. I think the pushing is going to be valuable for that, especially if you really lean into it. And then I think the pulling is actually going to help with downhill running, because it's just going to put like, you sort of get that, like, downhill running is that eccentric load where like you brace for that higher, like quadricep contraction. I think that going backwards is just going to like really kind of stabilize that area around the knee, and be helpful for that. So, I think I'm going to keep that in the routine. I just got the sled like a couple weeks ago, so this is all kind of new to
Nice.
I've pushed and pulled sleds throughout in training, but at a much lower capacity. It's more like a little higher intensity and like, maybe 10, 15 minutes worth of like workout with it. Whereas now it's like longer and slower with it.
Right. That's cool. Hopefully I don't get an injury, but if I do, I'm going to have to steal that one.
Well, it was kind of a progression because like with a sacroiliac stress fracture, you want to stop running immediately because that's like really jarring to it. And you can usually start biking almost right away as long as it doesn't cause any discomfort. And then single leg resistance training is usually doable, but if you notice it aggravating it, you should stop immediately. And then like pushing and pulling at like a low impact, so like the sled stuff, is something that I wouldn't have been able to do that right away, but after I think about 3 weeks I could do that without any pain. So then it's like, then you kind of want to actually strengthen the areas around it and try to make sure you're not putting yourself in a position where you've kind of atrophied so much that the return is going to be like kind of a risky endeavor as well. So, but anyway, so my training volume is actually fairly high right now. It's just not running based. I'm getting probably 2-3 hours worth of workout per day.
Nice.
Mostly through biking, some strength work, and then the sled pushing stuff.
When you aren't injured, is it typically about the same volume?
Pretty close.
About 2 to 3 hours a day?
The running stuff there's a limiter on it. Impact is going to be the big limiter. So like you can always cycle, swim, and that sort of stuff a lot more because you're just not getting the impact like you are running. It's pretty rare that when I'm running, I'm getting much past like say 20 hours a week of running.
20 is a lot.
It is a lot, and that's usually peak.
Yeah.
And on average, it's probably closer to 10, 12, 15 in that ballpark if you're looking at it over the course of the year and kind of blending in every side of it. And I find like when I am doing trail stuff more, I can do a little more volume just because you're kind of lowering impact to some degree on that, and you're just getting a little more variety. I find that, like, generally speaking, if I do too much flat stuff for too long, that's when things start to get. I just had like a bad fortune with I injured my right ankle. When was that? When I was doing the training for that transcon, and then I had like I rebuilt up, but then I re-aggravated it. So like I had like the last 2 years I had some this on and off ankle issue going on, and then I finally got through all of that, like to where it was like 100%. I could start trusting it on like basically anything, to where like I was like, there's a window of time where I could do a lot of runnable stuff on like roads and track, but like getting on technical trail probably was going to be too much for it. Whereas now the ankle's perfectly fine on any type of trail. But historically, I like the flat runnable ultras as kind of like my priority, but I can't keep doing them. Like if I keep doing them, I find myself getting into like this real like both physical and mental like one direction, and it just becomes unsustainable.
It's so repetitive.
Yeah.
I feel like.
Yeah. So I've been ready to get back on the trails for a while now, and I was going to do one more like track ultra before kind of picking a 100-mile trail race to do. So with this injury, that took that flat ultra off the table. So now like when I get fully through this, I'm going back to the trails and
Nice.
gonna do that for a while. I think that I usually stay more healthy when every couple seasons I switch to the trails for a little bit. And
do you have one in mind?
Yeah, with all luck, or with any luck, I think I'll do Javelina 100, which is a very runnable trail. Right. But I'd like to do a more like real mountain trail too. So if I can get ready for it in time, there's actually this really cool race I want to do at some point. It's 100K in Tahoe, and there's only 3 aid stations. It's every 15 miles.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and you go you have no crew, no pacers, so it's like pretty self-sufficient. Yeah. So I think that'd be just a fun one to do, where it's like have a pack at each one of those aid stations, just swap it in and out, and then no crew, no pacer. And
damn,
that one sounds fun. That one's at the end of July, so like my hope, I think I can maybe make that target if the sled pushing and cycling translates well enough.
Right.
The sledding and biking does not translate for the flat running very well, right. But for mountain stuff, I think it probably does a lot better. So I've got my fingers crossed, but I'm not going to force it. So we'll see.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you while we're on this is living in a place like Austin, where we've got some hills, but obviously not mountains. Like if you know you're training for a very mountainous race, lots of incline, lots of decline, how do you go about doing that living in a place like Austin where there's not a lot of ways to simulate that? Yeah,
you should have my wife on the podcast. She can tell you more about that.
Oh yeah.
I'm just kidding, but you could have her on. She would tell you about it, because the funny thing is she's an ultra runner too, and she's done very well, but she loves the trail mountain stuff. But she lived in Dallas for 10 years. Phoenix was actually our best spot to have access to that stuff. In Phoenix, we had access to everything.
Right.
But here in Austin, it's like, rolling hills is kind of the extent of it. But she's been top 10 at Western States 3 times, and done really well at mountain courses and things. And really, what I think the way to think about it is just overall fitness is the controllable, and that's going to be the big mover anyway. So get that, and then once you get like closer to the race itself, try to find some opportunities to get some exposure to. So whether that's just doing some more hill repeats and things like that, going to like going out to like a trip or something, so you can do like a training camp type of thing, can be useful. And then I think you can get sort of creative too. Like I think the sled pushing and pulling stuff has a lot of potential for that. Especially if you do it at a slow, like mimic the intensity. You can always do uphill on a treadmill. That's an easy one. The hard part really is going to be downhill running.
I've found that 100%. Yeah. So
like there's some like eccentric moves you can do in the gym that are kind of gonna be good for like really getting that eccentric load on your quadriceps is going to be helpful. So like even if you have to do hill repeats, I think like getting some of that into running is going to be good. But yeah, trying to maybe move your lower body strength routine to more eccentric type stuff is going to be valuable. And then generally, I think just pacing properly. I think like if you find yourself bombing down hills, you don't have a lot of downhill running, you're going to set yourself up for a lot more of a problem at the end. That's what happened to me last year, because I did the Bighorn 50 last summer. And that was my first like real ultra.
and I think it's like over 50 miles. It's like 14,000 feet of descent, so it's a lot of descent. And I trained for it here, and it just basically zero eccentric, like zero downhill training, and by like 15, 20 miles in, my quads were wrecked, my knees were wrecked, my front of my toes from like the downhill. It's like nothing was used to that. The incline was totally fine. I looked forward to the incline. So I was like, okay, this is like a little reprieve from the downhill. But so this time around, have you guys been out to the Hill of Life?
I was just going to ask you if you've been there. Yeah, that's the spot. Yeah,
I've been out there the last few weekends. I'm going to go out there tomorrow again. But just do, 2 or 3 hours of hill repeats on that. Yeah. That just getting that downhill especially has been super helpful.
And Hill of Life is technical enough too, where you will practice some of that foot placement. Because that's the other thing. You're just jamming your toes. And so
I was also wearing way too narrow shoes. I switched to ultras now. I know you're a big ultra guy.
Oh, sweet. Nice.
And that made a massive difference too.
Yeah. Do you remember which model you used?
Last summer it was the Salomon Ultra Glides.
Okay. So they're pretty narrow.
Pretty narrow, yeah. And then now I go back and forth between the Lone Peaks and then the Mont Blancs.
Oh yeah. The Mont Blanc's been a fun add to that lineup.
I just wore them for the first time last weekend. I loved them.
Did you?
Because I wore the Lone Peaks for a 50K up in Colorado a couple weeks ago, and I loved them. Like, they're super comfy, but I could tell towards the end, because there's hardly any cushion on those, that like I needed a little bit more. And it was on a road for the most part. It's like a dirt, like fire road. So I picked up the Mont Blanc just to have a little bit more cushion.
Yeah. I find people who like the Lone Peak like the Olympus, and then people who like the Mont Blanc like the Superior, or vice versa.
Okay.
So Superior is a little more low profile even than the Lone Peak, but it's built on the same last as the Mont Blanc is. Okay. So they kind of have the same fit. And when you get those like up and down hill courses, like getting that fit and that ankle or that like heel lock just right, that BOA system works really well though.
Right.
Yeah.
Those are sweet. I think I might get the Olympus. My race is in like 2 weeks, so I have like 1 or 2 more chances to test out the Olympus, but I might pick those up too, especially if you recommend them. Yeah.
If you like the fit of the Lone Peak, but you just want more cushion, the Olympus is a good option. It's a pretty big stack height difference than the Lone Peak, so you will notice that. So if you've been in the Mont Blanc though, then you're probably going to it's comparable enough where you won't feel like you're on stilts.
Okay.
Or if you've worn max cushion in the past. It's funny because like, when I first started ultra running, you had to really have that conversation, because like other than Hoka, there really wasn't any max cushion shoes out there.
Right.
So then it was like, is this person going to be like tripping all over the place on this max? Now so many people wear max cushion shoes, even on the roads, because the super shoe tech is all max cushion down. Now that's kind of like the standard.
Yeah. It's it seems like for the road, I definitely want as much cushion as possible, just because it's so much harder. But the trails I've found, at least after wearing the Lone Peaks, like having less cushion, especially the wide toes, that was huge for me. Just letting your toes splay out properly, and wearing barefoot shoes every day helps a lot as well.
Yeah. If you can strengthen those foot muscles, that's huge for the longer stuff. And then just in general too, because it always ends up further up the kinetic chain if things get problematic. So if you get weak lower legs, then eventually those get weak in the longer miles, and then all of a sudden you get the knees, the hips, the quads, and then
it's all those little things, and just more and more time building on it. All right, let's go back to the original question I had of day in the life of Zach.
Sure. Yeah. I keep tangenting us here.
That's okay.
So I think we made it to the mid morning. I'm like, I'll usually do like 60 to 90 at most. 2 hours is kind of the first training session, unless it's a weekend long run build. And that's kind of the core workout for the day. So I'll come back and I'll have like probably my bigger meal of the day, or one of my bigger meals of the day right after that, kind of like mid to late morning, depending on how early I start. That is going to be like, I'm going to have a little more carbohydrate in that one than I will like some of my other, because it's following a pretty big training session. So sometimes I'll just have a little bit more fruit or something like that with eggs, full fat yogurt. I've been on like a huge like full fat dairy kick right now, partly just because of the bone injury.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Leaning into that. So right now I've been going through like full tubs of full fat yogurt every day.
Do you do like the raw milk at all?
I haven't a ton, but I do. And you talked to Mike, so you probably heard his story, and he's big into the raw milk. So I think we've got a Sprouts like half a mile from our house. So I think I might just go grab a couple just to mix it into their rotation.
Do they have it at Sprouts? I didn't know they did.
They do, yeah. They sell it at Sprouts.
I've been going to the Georgetown Farmers Market. They have it there, but
cool.
I gotta check out Sprouts.
Yeah, I need to find like a local farmer who's not too far away and just buy it right from the source. But
I think it tastes so much better, and it's way easier on my stomach too.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm like lactose intolerant or what, but the raw milk has been great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm really into the yogurts and stuff right now, and the kefir and that, all that stuff. So I'll usually have something like that with it too. And, then I usually hit like the other side of kind of my lifestyle, which is the podcasting and coaching stuff. So, I'll usually go back and forth between those, whether it's recording a podcast, editing a podcast, or just doing coaching plans. So, usually Tuesdays are my big like coaching plan update days, where I'm basically invest most of that day into just getting all my plans set up for the next round. And then from there, it's basically just kind of like, then I have the output information, and then it's like the input from the clients, and then scheduling the calls and things like that. And yeah, that's usually like a good, probably 4 to 6 hour chunk of time, that I'll spend on either coaching or podcast related stuff, some social media stuff here and there. I'm trying to get better at that. And that's a whole nother world that you could spend a full-time job on if you really want to take it seriously. That's what you figure out. It's like, oh, I like these 3 or 4 different things. And you realize, oh, I could just do only this, and it would be a full-time job if I really wanted to. So that's what kind of the balance I have going on right now, is I have to kind of like balance the training side of things, the coaching side of things, and the podcast. Those are the main ones. And just kind of figuring out like what parts of the year I can kind of like flex in more or less than other ones, and where like the client threshold is for me, and like, how many consultations can I take on in a week and still manage, and then how many podcasts is the right number. And just, I've more or less got that pretty fine tuned, and it's just about kind of like making sure I have enough kind of structure there that I put it in the right place. But usually kind of mid to late afternoon, I'll head out for like a second training session. If it's kind of like peak training, that's usually some sort of run with a strength session. If it's not peak training time of year, and volume's a little lower, it's usually just some sort of strength type of thing, or cross training activity or something like that. And and then it's I'll come back, I'll eat my second biggest meal of the day, catch up on any extra work that came in while I was out there on that next training session, between emails from coaching clients, just general stuff. My wife's usually getting done with work around that time too. We both work from home, so we're kind of crossing each other's paths over the course of the day, but we both have very different careers. She does like healthcare compliance for a company called Willis Towers Watson, but remotely. So she's over there talking about like healthcare related acronyms and things like that. I'm over talking about endurance training. So we're speaking 2 different languages, even though we're right next door. So usually we'll hang out in the evenings and do stuff. And
do you guys have kids or anything?
No, 2 dogs, no kids.
Nice.
So
dogs are the way to go, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's where we're at. So yeah, no, it's fun.
That's cool. How old are you guys?
I'm 37 and she's 41.
Nice.
41. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's a pretty damn good life. Once you you can lock in like a good routine, especially being self-employed and working from home, and like you're in charge of your day and your schedule. That's so powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. And Austin is so great, I think, because we're both pretty busy with the stuff we're doing. And then when you pile training on top of it, it's like, okay, I got to get around to doing some social stuff too, just to make sure I'm not turning into a hermit.
Yeah.
And I think that's sometimes the hardest part. And Austin's just been great with that. And Phoenix was great too, but we were Phoenix is so spread out. We were like up in North Central Phoenix. So it's like anything was like 30 minutes away. So at the end of the day on a weekday, it was so hard to convince yourself to do anything.
What brought you guys to Austin from Phoenix?
So what ended up happening is my wife's job used to be remote, but had a lot of travel, in the sense that she'd have to go like to East Coast, West Coast, probably a couple times a month. So Phoenix worked really well from like an airport standpoint for her. And then for me, I'm 100% self-employed now. At the time, I was mostly self-employed, but I was doing some marketing work for Ultra Footwear at the time too. That was kind of Phoenix, New Mexico, centralized, or in that type of area. So over the pandemic, I kind of moved more stuff towards my coaching and podcasting stuff, and kind of I was at a point where it was better to just go all in on my stuff. And during the pandemic, her travel got canceled out altogether, and then her industry has sort of shifted more towards remote for that side of things too. So she still travels to some degree, but not enough to make the airport the deciding factor of where we live. So at the time, we were actually thinking about, because Phoenix summers are like even worse than Austin for the most part.
Really? I guess
it's just dry. It's different, but it's more oppressive, and it's just constant. Whereas you get breaks here and there in Austin. Last summer was pretty brutal, I won't lie, but like so far this year has been pretty nice comparatively. Although this is probably an easy year as far as averages go. But yeah, so we were actually looking at maybe trying to get a second place somewhere up in Colorado just to get out of the heat in the summer just to make Phoenix sustainable from training and an enjoyment standpoint. And while we were kind of in that process, we were like, well, if we're going to do this, we're probably going to be pretty tied to Phoenix. So we just started asking those questions, and we probably would have moved to Austin originally when we went to Phoenix had that been a viable option at the time. And we just kind of realized that it was now. So we thought, well, let's just look into that. And I ended up in Austin, I think 5 times that year before we moved. So after the 4th time, I was like sold on it. I think Nicole was always pretty sold on it. So we decided, let's do it. And we moved here. What was it? January of 2022. Yeah, so we've been here for a year and a half.
Nice. That's when we got here, January 22 also.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah, we love it here. It's like the people are amazing. I think that's the best part about it is it's kind of a big melting pot too. There's not a lot of people here that are originally from Austin now, it seems like. And so everybody's kind of in the same boat of like they're trying to get out, meet people, socialize. Yeah. And so everybody's super friendly and welcoming. And there's just always something going on. There's so much to do here. Yeah,
and it's compartmentalized to a degree as well, where like you don't have to be in the center of the city to have a lot of options. There's stuff everywhere. We're pretty centrally located, so that's nice. We have a lot of options there, and that was part of the idea was like, okay, this time let's get walking distance or at least like 5-minute drive, 10-minute drive to some stuff where we can, do some stuff on the weeknights and not feel like we're just rinsing and repeating all the time. Yeah. So,
how long do you guys plan on staying here for just the foreseeable future?
Yeah. I don't want to move.
It's a pain in the ass. It's stressful.
So I went, when I finished college, I was teaching before I kind of jumped in on coaching and endurance stuff. And from that, I went to, so I graduated from Stevens Point. I did my student teaching in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. And then I did like some long-term subbing there while I picked up some extra certifications. Then I was in Oshkosh, Wisconsin for a year. Took my first full-time teaching job up in Marinette, Wisconsin. From there, went to Madison, Wisconsin for 2 years. Then I moved out to California, kind of Sacramento area and Davis for a few years. Met my wife, Nicole. We moved to Phoenix. So now I went from Phoenix to Austin. So that's all been in the last like 12 years or so. Dang. And it's just like, so at this point, it just feels like I can't make it more than 2 or 3 years before I move, and I'm just sick of moving. And I think Austin's the spot where I'm not going to want to anyway. So
yeah, I think it's a really good central hub. I mean, you're literally in the middle of the country for the most part, east to west coast, and the weather. I mean, it's running weather year round. Summers a little bit less running temperatures, I suppose, but yeah, I think Austin's such a cool spot. You guys have been all over the place though.
Yeah. My wife grew up in northern Illinois, kind of just north of Chicago. So we both were kind of from the same general area. And then she was actually in Dallas for 10 years before we met. So we've bounced around a little bit, but it's been fun.
Nice.
It's cool just to be able to see the places and kind of recognize, because I think now I have the perspective I need in order to, I've never lived on the East Coast, but or the Southeast, but I feel like, and there's some spots over there I'd be curious about, but I don't think I'd be curious enough to leave Austin for them. So
yeah, we were talking about this before the podcast, but we moved around a little bit as well. And I think you really get a good sense of what your values are, like what's important to you in a location. Like, do you need to have scenery? Do you need to have like conveniences? Like there's so many different variables and where you're choosing to live. Yeah. And I think no matter where you go, there's always gonna be pros and cons. But yeah, finding a place that you enjoy is pretty important. What is your guys's or what is Zach Bitter's like grand vision? Do you have like a big goal for the next like 5-10 years or even longer?
Yeah, I've got a lot of exciting things that I'd like to do. I think for the runnable 100-mile stuff, I still think I haven't done my fastest time. I haven't really gotten a good crack at 100 miles with the new super shoe technology yet. So I ran 11:19 as my fastest 100 miler. So that's just under 6:48 pace. And
was that on the track?
Yeah. Okay. Yep. Yeah. So I think the shoes alone probably gets me under 11 hours. And then if I can get a little faster one way or the other, like I think that sub 11 would be a cool thing to be able to do. So that would be something I'd like to do. But I'd also like to, jump back into the trails for a little bit, do some trail 100 milers. So that's probably kind of be my target. Will be kind of going back and forth between kind of some trail stuff and the flat runnable 100 stuff for the next probably 5 years or so. And then I might start phasing in some longer stuff there. I'd like to try some of those 200 milers at some point.
They're getting pretty popular.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, there's just some cool multi-day stuff that I think eventually, I take it like in phases, because I always tell myself like, yeah, okay, as long as it's still exciting to do the training and stuff like that. Like, even if the race is miserable, that's a very small reason to do or not do it. So that's not the driver for me for the most part, but is like, do I enjoy the lifestyle of preparing for it? And that really hasn't waned at all. The last couple of years have been weird with injuries, kind of just like off and on, but historically I've been very injury resistant. So I'm hoping that this is just like something that I need to get over for now, and then be back to that repetition. And then, I think like I haven't lost any excitement with it. So when you look at just like a lot of the world records and things like that, you do get a little older in ultra marathoning. So there's some opportunity, especially as the distance gets longer.
Right.
So I think like as long as I stay excited about it, even in the next 10 years, I think I'll still be doing some form of ultra marathon at like a high level target anyway. And then kind of along the way, keep building up the podcast and coaching stuff, and that stuff's all real enjoyable. And I mean, who knows where the world's going to be at in 10 years?
Yeah.
It might not. Coaches might not exist. It might be AI.
It probably will be. We're all going to be irrelevant, basically. That's cool, Miller, man. I think that's one of the coolest things about ultra running is it seems like it's such a sustainable sport, or like it's a very, it's easy to have longevity in it.
Just keep moving up.
Yeah, as opposed to like a road marathon or half marathon or whatever. Like those are so much more reliant on physiology as opposed to the ultras. It's
the longer I get into it, the more respect I have for pro marathoners, because it's like the last of the like Olympic distance ones. So like if that's your world, if you're like Diamond League track and field, if you're road running and you're at the sub ultra, like, and for the majority of running, that's been the reality for any professional. It's only been recent that people are making careers out of ultra marathon running. So it's like you get to that marathon where that's the last thing left. And it's just like that repetition and that routine is so similar time in and time out that like if you can get yourself up to like really want to go after it year after year, that's so impressive to me, because for me, it's like I recognize this the most directly in 2019. I took a break from the flat runnable stuff because I had been like sort of banging my head against the wall to some degree at a few of those races where I was just like, there's just something missing. So I just took a break from it, trained for the San Diego 100. It was a totally different experience. Went back to it, and then it was just like a total reset. And I felt great. Had one of the best buildups that I've ever had. One of the most fun flat runnable buildups that I've ever had before. And that's when I ran my fastest 100 mile. And so I think like that, having that variety available in ultra marathon is probably the reason why I still want to keep doing it. But yeah, if you're just doing the marathon, that's a grind.
Yeah, that's the thing with ultra too, is every race is so different. You can do the mountainous stuff, you can do the flat road running or flat runnable stuff. I feel like it's hard to. I mean, everybody says running is boring, but in my opinion, it's hard to make running boring when you've got all these different variations. Yeah.
It's one of those things where it's boring if you're just doing it to try to like lose weight or something like that, or to try to stay healthy. But yeah, if you actually get into running and try to understand, and then like we talked about for a good chunk of this podcast, is just recognize like the different components and what they actually do. And it's like anything, I think, where like if you just surface level it, you never see the full iceberg.
That's right.
Whatever metaphor you want.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, dude. Let's end it right there. This is a ton of fun. I really enjoyed this. Where is the best place for people to find you and connect with you?
Yeah, well, thanks a bunch for having me on. It's been a blast chatting, Jeremy.
Like we could sit here for a few more hours, honestly.
Yeah, we can break a podcast record here.
I know. Joe Rogan style.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, finding me, the kind of central hub is my website, is zachbitter.com, ZACHBITTER.com. And then that's got like all my coaching stuff, podcast links and things like that on there. And then social media, I'm most active on Instagram, which is @ZachBitter. Perfect, dude. Well, you're doing some incredible things. You've done a shit ton of amazing things, and it's super impressive and definitely inspiring. And I'm excited to see all the other cool things you've got coming up. Awesome. Yeah. Well, thanks again for having me on. Sweet, dude. Thanks for coming on, man. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a review, and share it with a friend. We'll see you in the next one.